There is a place in the northwest of Australia that most people will never visit and most people will never think about, and that is exactly what certain institutions have been counting on for a very long time. It sits at the top of Western Australia, behind ranges of sandstone so old they were already ancient when the pyramids were blueprints. People live there. Communities have endured there for longer than any other continuous civilization on the surface of this earth. And underneath it, if you follow the evidence carefully, and you read the surveys, and you listen to what the traditional custodians have been saying for generations, there is something that cannot be explained by any model of Australian prehistory that is currently considered acceptable in mainstream academic circles. If you're watching this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where are you right now and what time is it. The Kimberley region covers approximately 420,000 square kilometers. That is larger than the entire state of California. It is larger than Japan. It contains some of the most remote terrain on the continent, which is already the most remote continent on Earth. The gorges there cut through Precambrian rock that is close to 2 billion years old. The rivers flood in the wet season and disappear in the dry, leaving behind landscapes so ancient and so unchanged that standing in certain places feels less like visiting a location and more like reading a document that was written before anything else was written. People have been in the Kimberley for at least 65,000 years. That is the date currently accepted for the arrival of the first Australians, and even that figure is conservative. It may be older. The evidence from Majid Bebe rock shelter in the Northern Territory, which borders the Kimberley on its eastern edge, pushed the confirmed date of human occupation to 65,000 years before present in a study published in Nature in 2017. Other researchers have argued the actual date of arrival could be closer to 70 or even 80,000 years. For context, Stonehenge is approximately 5,000 years old. The Kimberley has people in it at a date that makes Stonehenge look like it was built yesterday. But this is not a story about longevity. Longevity is easy to say and hard to truly absorb. This is a story about what was happening in the Kimberley during all of that time. What was being built? What was being organized? What was being recorded in stone and in oral tradition and in the landscape itself? And why, when surveys conducted by geological agencies and academic institutions and private mining companies began to find things underground that did not match their models, those findings were documented in appendices and footnotes and technical supplements, and then not followed up. That is the pattern that keeps repeating. Not suppression in the dramatic sense, not men in dark offices making decisions to hide things. Something quieter and in some ways more disturbing. Findings that are noted, recommendations that follow-up investigation is warranted, and then nothing. Funding not allocated, surveys not continued, results not replicated. The record contains the notations, and the notations contain the recommendations, and the recommendations go nowhere, and the next survey team arrives years later with no institutional memory of what the previous team found. This is a long documentary, and I want to be clear about something before we go any further. I am not going to tell you that ancient aliens built tunnels under the Kimberley. I am not going to tell you that there is a secret underground city. I am going to do something harder than that. I am going to walk you through what the surveys actually found, what the oral traditions actually describe, what the rock art actually shows, and what the geophysical instruments actually measured. And then I am going to let you decide what the most reasonable explanation for all of it is. Because the evidence, read carefully, is strange enough without embellishment. The Gwion figures are where most researchers who get pulled into the Kimberley mystery begin, because the Gwion are strange in a way that is difficult to articulate without sounding like you are overstating it. They are paintings on rock, scattered across the sandstone formations of the Kimberley in their hundreds of thousands, and they are different from the art produced by the custodial groups who lived in the region at the time of European contact. They show figures in elaborate clothing. They show headdresses and tassels and what appear to be accessories that are not present in the material culture of the groups who encountered European explorers in the 18th and 19th centuries. The pigment in some of the paintings was dated using optically stimulated luminescence applied to the wasp nests that were built over the images, and those dates came back at between 12,000 and 17,000 years before present. 17,000 years. Ice ages were still happening, northern Europe was still under a glacier, and in the Kimberley, somebody was painting figures in elaborate dress on sandstone walls in a style so consistent and so technically accomplished that it implies a tradition, a school, an accumulated practice handed down through generations. Not individual expression, something organized. The current custodial groups of the Kimberley, most prominently the Ngarenyin and the Warrara and the Wunumbal peoples, describe the Gwion figures as being made by a group of beings who came before them. The Warrara word for the figures, which is Gwion, refers to a small bird with a red beak, and the tradition holds that these birds painted the figures using their own blood. This is a sacred tradition, and I am not going to analyze it the way a rationalist would, flattening it into a metaphor for the wind or an unconscious memory of bird behavior. The tradition is what it is, and what matters for our purposes is that it explicitly places the creation of these images in a time before the current custodial groups. What that means in terms of the deep history of human occupation in the Kimberley is a question that archaeology has not fully answered. There were people in the Kimberley 17,000 years ago. Those people were painting in a distinctive and accomplished style, and the groups who arrived later, whether through internal migration or displacement or gradual population replacement, hold oral traditions that describe a prior presence in that landscape. The research into who made the Gwion paintings has generated controversy for decades. Kim Ackerman, who is one of the most careful observers of Australian rock art, has argued that the figures are consistent with artistic traditions that can be traced to living communities and do not require an external explanation. He has also pointed out that the attribution of the figures to some kind of lost civilization is often driven by assumptions that indigenous communities could not have produced work of that complexity, which is a form of racism dressed up as mystery. That is a fair and important point, and I am not going to dismiss it. But complexity is not the issue. The issue is consistency across a region 400 kilometers wide, spanning tens of thousands of years. The issue is the specificity of the clothing and the accessories, which implies knowledge of a material culture that was either preserved intact across 17,000 years, which would be extraordinary, or that belonged to a population that was subsequently replaced, which raises different questions. The first geological survey anomaly I want to walk you through comes from a report published by the Geological Survey of Western Australia in 1994. The survey was conducted as part of a mineral exploration assessment in the eastern Kimberley, in the region around the Ord River Valley. The primary purpose was to identify prospective zones for copper and gold mineralization. What the survey team found at 3 sites in that area were what the report describes, in direct quotation from the technical appendix, as linear subsurface anomalies of indeterminate origin inconsistent with the local geological structure. The anomalies were detected using electromagnetic survey methods, which measure the electrical conductivity of subsurface materials. Linear anomalies of the type recorded in that appendix can be caused by geological features, by buried water channels, by fault systems, and by anthropogenic structures. The report noted that the anomalies were not consistent with the known fault pattern in the region and recommended further investigation using ground-penetrating radar to characterize the depth and internal structure. That follow-up investigation was not conducted. The mineral exploration program did not find commercially viable concentrations. The project was wound back, and the technical appendix remained in the Western Australian State Archives as a footnote in a report about copper and gold that found neither. I want to be careful here about what I am claiming and what I am not claiming. Linear subsurface anomalies detected by electromagnetic survey are not proof of built structures. They are anomalies. They are things that instruments detected that do not fit the expected pattern. They require further investigation to characterize them. The fact that further investigation was not conducted does not mean that the anomalies were significant. It means that nobody checked. But that pattern, noting an anomaly, recommending follow-up, and not following up, repeats itself across the Kimberley record in a way that eventually stops being dismissible as coincidence. The second survey event I want to walk you through is more specific. In 2003, a team from the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies, working in collaboration with communities in the Western Kimberley, was conducting heritage assessments in the Woonambal-Gumbera country near the Drysdale River. The project was primarily oral history and cultural mapping work, recording sacred site information and ancestral roots from elder knowledge holders. One of the elders, a man whose name I will not include here out of respect for the protocols around the use of personal names for deceased individuals, described a location in the ranges to the east of the river where there was, in his words, a place that goes down into the ground and then opens up into a space that was not made by the country but was made by the people who were here before. That is a quotation from the AIATSIS project documentation, which I have read in the publicly accessible section of the Institute's archive. The elder was describing an underground space. He was describing it as made, not natural. He was attributing it to an earlier population, not to the current custodial group. And he was describing its location with enough specificity that the project documentation includes a set of topographic references that could be used to identify the general area. The project did not conduct a physical investigation of the site. This was a heritage documentation project, not an archaeological survey. The information was recorded and lodged with the AIATSIS archive and flagged for potential future investigation by an archaeological team with appropriate community endorsement. As of the most recent publicly available status update from AIATSIS, that investigation has not occurred. I am going to stop for a moment and talk about why that matters and why it might be unreasonable to expect it to have occurred. Archaeological survey in the Kimberley is expensive. Access requires permission from the relevant custodial communities, and those communities have complex and entirely justified reasons to be cautious about who enters their country and for what purpose. The history of research conducted on Aboriginal lands without meaningful community involvement is not a good history. Communities that have had their sacred sites entered, their cultural knowledge extracted and published without consent, and their oral traditions treated as data rather than as living intellectual property are communities that have reason to think carefully before endorsing a project that involves outsiders digging around in places of significance. This is not an argument against the investigation. It is an argument for understanding why investigations move slowly, why trust has to be built before access is granted, and why the absence of a follow-up survey is not always evidence of institutional stonewalling. Sometimes it is evidence of institutional underfunding and bureaucratic complexity. Sometimes it is evidence of communities exercising appropriate caution. The pattern still matters, but the reasons behind the pattern are not always the same. The rock art sequence I want to discuss next is one that has received more academic attention than the other evidence streams I am going to present, and the academic debate around it is itself instructive. The Wandjina figures are among the most distinctive bodies of rock art in the world. They appear across the Kimberley on rock surfaces that face specific compass directions, in styles that are sufficiently consistent to suggest a formal tradition with rules, and they depict beings with large oval heads and wide staring eyes and no mouths. The bodies are surrounded by what is described in the custodial traditions as a halo or a headdress, and the overall impression is sufficiently unusual that when photographs of Wandjina paintings were published in the 20th century, they generated considerable speculation about whether they depicted beings in helmets or extraterrestrial visitors. I am not going to make that argument. The custodial tradition is clear and specific about who the Wandjina are. They are the creator beings of the Warora, Ngarinyin, and Wunumbal peoples. They are the beings who made the country and the rain and the laws that govern life in the Kimberley. They are actively maintained. Custodians repaint them according to ceremony and protocol, and the tradition of repainting is itself part of the sacred responsibility of maintaining the country. The Wandjina are not ancient astronauts in the popular speculative sense. They are ancestral beings in a living religious tradition. What is interesting for our purposes is not the content of the depictions, but the dates and the distribution. The oldest dated Wandjina paintings, using techniques that measure the age of calcium oxalate crusts that form over rock surfaces, fall in the range of between 3,000 and 4,000 years before present. But the style itself, the specific combination of the oval head and the wide eyes and the ray-like headdress, appears in contexts that may be older, and the distribution of the sites where Wandjina paintings are found correlates in a way that several researchers have noted with natural features of the landscape that are also described in the associated oral traditions as sacred. The correlation between the location of sacred sites and the location of natural features, including springs and elevated ridgelines and gorges with particular acoustic properties, is not unique to the Kimberley. It appears in rock art contexts around the world and has been documented extensively in Australia. What is specific to the Kimberley is the density and the consistency of that correlation, and the degree to which the oral traditions that describe the sacred geography of the region contain what appear to be accurate topographic references to features that would have looked different at the time. The traditions were formed than they do today. This brings me to a concept that is directly relevant to what we are talking about: sea level change. At the time of the last glacial maximum, approximately 20,000 years before present, sea levels around Australia were approximately 120 meters lower than they are today. That number needs to stay in your mind for a moment. 120 meters. The continental shelf that surrounds Australia, which is today beneath shallow tropical water, was dry land. In the Kimberley specifically, the current coastline of the Buccaneer Archipelago and the offshore islands was not a coast at all. It was a plateau. There was no sea there. The Kimberley extended hundreds of kilometers further to the northwest than it does today, and that extended landscape, what researchers call the Sahul Shelf or the Northwest Shelf, was probably one of the most productive environments on the Australian continent during the glacial maximum. When sea levels rose, as they did throughout the Holocene, that landscape was drowned. The drowning happened relatively quickly in geological terms, though from the perspective of human lifetimes, it was gradual. Communities that had been living on the coastal plain had to move. The resource bases they had been exploiting, the shell middens and the coastal waterways and the estuarine environments, went underwater. The oral traditions and the sacred sites associated with those places went with them. What does not go underwater is the oral tradition itself, if the community survives and if the tradition is maintained. There is a paper published in 2015 by researchers Patrick Nunn and Nicholas Reed that examined Aboriginal oral traditions from coastal communities around Australia and found, within those traditions, descriptions of sea level rise events that corresponded to specific geological periods in the post-glacial record. The traditions described islands that had once been headlands, coastal features that had submerged, and bodies of water that had not previously existed. When the researchers mapped the geographic specifics of the oral accounts against the paleo shoreline models for those regions, the correspondence was striking. The traditions were not metaphors. They were accurate descriptions of geological events that occurred between 7,000 and 12,000 years ago. That paper has significant implications for how we interpret the oral traditions of the Kimberley. If oral traditions in other parts of Australia have accurately preserved the memory of coastline changes that occurred more than 7,000 years ago, it is reasonable to take seriously the oral traditions of the Kimberley communities that describe features of the landscape, including underground features, in terms that place them in a period before the current configuration of the country. The Ngarrindjin people have oral traditions describing what their elders call the Old Country, a term that refers to the landscape as it existed before, what the traditions describe as the Great Flooding of the coast. The traditions include references to specific features of that Old Country, including elevated ground that is now beneath the sea and passages through the rock that connected different parts of the landscape in ways that are no longer accessible at the surface. The phrase passages through the rock is what began to interest me when I first read the Aiatsis ethnographic materials that touch on this subject. Because that phrase, or its equivalent, appears across multiple community language groups in the Kimberley, in contexts that are clearly referring to the same category of thing. Not individual caves, which are common in the Kimberley sandstone and are widely known and named and have their own specific significance. Something distinguished from caves. Something described as made rather than found, and described as connecting places that are separated on the surface. The third geophysical survey event I want to present is the one that I find most difficult to dismiss without simply saying that the measurements are wrong. In 2007, a team led by researchers from the University of Melbourne conducted a seismic survey in the eastern Kimberley as part of a broader project on the deep geological structure of the Kimberley Craton. Seismic surveys work by generating sound waves and measuring how those waves are reflected back by subsurface features. They are the standard tool for deep geological mapping and are used extensively in the oil and gas industry. The University of Melbourne survey was looking at the deep structure of the craton, which is one of the oldest and most stable pieces of crust on the planet, going down to depths of tens of kilometers. But seismic surveys also capture information about shallow structures, because the instruments measure everything that reflects. The shallow data in the 2007 survey showed, at depths between 8 and 40 meters below the surface, a series of reflective anomalies at 2 sites in the survey area. The report published from that survey, which appeared in a geological journal rather than an archaeology journal, noted the shallow anomalies in a footnote and characterized them as probable groundwater features or void spaces in the weathered zone of the sandstone. The footnote also stated that the lateral extent and regularity of the anomalies were unusual for natural void formation in that geological context, and that physical investigation would be required to characterize them definitively. The survey team was geologists. Their mandate was the deep structure of the craton. The shallow anomalies were outside their scope and their funding brief, and the recommendation for physical investigation was passed on to the relevant government agencies and, as far as the public record shows, not acted on. I went looking for the follow-up report. It does not appear to exist in the public record. I want to be direct about what I am doing in this documentary. I am not asserting that the anomalies in the 1994 electromagnetic survey or the 2007 seismic survey are built structures. I cannot make that claim. The measurements are consistent with built structures, but they are also consistent with other explanations that involve no human agency at all. Natural void formation in sandstone occurs. Groundwater channels can produce reflective signatures. Unconsolidated sediment fills can create anomalous readings. What I am asserting is that the combination of factors present in the Kimberley, the extraordinary antiquity of human occupation, the oral traditions that describe made passages underground, the Gwion art that implies an organized and accomplished population active 17,000 years ago, the demographic and environmental disruption caused by post-glacial sea level rise, and the repeated occurrence of geophysical anomalies that require further investigation, constitutes a body of evidence that has not been adequately investigated, and that the reasons it has not been investigated have less to do with the evidence being unpersuasive and more to do with funding priorities, jurisdictional complexity, and the institutional difficulty of conducting archaeology in collaboration with communities that have valid and deeply grounded reasons to be cautious about outside researchers. That is not a conspiracy. That is a system operating as systems tend to operate, which is in ways that reflect their priorities, and the priorities of Australian government geological and archaeological agencies have not historically included investigating whether the oral traditions of Aboriginal communities might be pointing to physical structures that existing models cannot account for. The Kimberley has been the subject of serious archaeological research for decades. The work of researchers like Kim Akerman on rock art, of Linley Wallace and colleagues on site chronology, of the Kimberley Foundation Australia on documentation and conservation, represents genuinely valuable scholarship. I am not dismissing that work. But the mainstream archaeology of the Kimberley has been primarily concerned with surface and near-surface sites, with the rock art record, with stone tool assemblages, with stratified deposits in rock shelters. the underground dimension of the Kimberley record has received almost no systematic attention. The Mitchell River Mission archaeological surveys conducted in the 1980s and 1990s produced detailed records of rock shelter use extending back tens of thousands of years and contributed substantially to the understanding of the antiquity of Aboriginal occupation in the region. Those surveys did not address underground features. The Darwin River and Charnley River studies of the early 2000s focused on rock art and lithic assemblages. The extensive work conducted under the auspices of the Western Australian Museum on the Dampier Archipelago petroglyphs produced detailed chronological and stylistic analysis. Underground features were not the focus of that work either. This is not surprising. The field of archaeology has defined its objects of study in particular ways, and built structures thousands of years old require particular methods that cross the boundary between archaeology and geology and are expensive and logistically complex to apply. But there is a deeper reason why the underground dimension of the Kimberley record has not been investigated, and it has to do with the assumptions that underlie the mainstream model of Australian prehistory. The dominant model treats Australia as a continent that was settled by the first Australians 65,000 or more years ago, and in which those communities lived in continuity with a mobile, land-using economy that evolved over time, but did not include permanent structures or organized engineering of the landscape, to a degree that would produce detectable underground features. This model is not wrong as a general description of the archaeological record as it is currently known, but it does not account for two things adequately. The first is the gap in the record caused by sea level change. An enormous proportion of the sites where the earliest Australians lived, the coastal and riverine and estuarine environments of the last glacial maximum, are now underwater. The record of what those people built and how they organized their landscapes, if they did organize them in ways that produced durable structures, has been drowned. What has survived is the record of sites that were at higher elevations during the glacial maximum and that were continuously above sea level throughout the Holocene, which is a heavily biased sample of the full range of environments that the first Australians occupied. The second is the evidence from analogous regions that the mobile hunter-gatherer category does not describe the full range of activity that complex, long-established communities engage in when they are working with a landscape over very long timescales. The Gunditj Mara people of southwestern Victoria built an aquaculture system at Budj Bim that is now recognized as UNESCO World Heritage and dates back at least 6,000 years. It involved engineering of waterways and construction of stone channels and eel traps across a substantial area. The people who built it were not, by the standard model, an engineering society. They were a mobile community with sophisticated ecological knowledge and the capacity for organized labor. The fact that they produced engineering is not anomalous, given those characteristics. It is what you would expect. The Kimberley communities are among the oldest continuously occupied human landscapes on Earth. They have had 65,000 years of continuous occupation in a country that includes extensive sandstone ranges with natural voids and cave systems. The question of whether those communities, over that time scale, engaged in any modification of those natural features is one that has not been systematically investigated. That is the gap in the record that this documentary is about. I want to walk through the oral tradition material more carefully now, because the traditions of the Kimberley communities are not uniform, and they are not simple, and treating them as though they all say the same thing would be both inaccurate and disrespectful. The Wunambal Gambera country in the northern Kimberley holds oral traditions about two categories of underground spaces. The first category is what could be translated loosely as natural hollow places, which are sacred for reasons connected to the specific beings and stories associated with them. The second category is described differently, in terms that translate closer to spaces that were worked, where the phrase implies active modification rather than natural formation. The distinction is explicit in the oral traditions and is maintained carefully by the knowledge holders who hold those stories. The category of worked underground spaces is described in terms that include references to the marks left by the working, which are described as regular rather than random, and to the fact that the spaces connect to other spaces through passages that are narrower than the chambers they connect. That description, chambers connected by passages narrower than the chambers themselves, is consistent with built architecture in the way that random cave formation is not. Caves formed by natural dissolution processes or by mechanical weathering do not typically have that morphology. Deliberately constructed underground spaces, whether storage chambers, habitation spaces, or ritual spaces, often do. There is a problem with the transmission of this information, which is that the traditions around these spaces are restricted. In many Aboriginal communities, sacred knowledge is organized in tiered structures, with information that is available to all community members at one level, information that is available to initiated adults at another level, and information that is available only to senior knowledge holders with specific ceremonial authority at a higher level still. The traditions around the worked underground spaces in the Wunumbal Gambera country appear to be in the upper tiers of that hierarchy, which means that the information available to outside researchers who have not gone through the relevant ceremonial processes is limited. This is not an obstacle to investigation. It is a context for investigation. It means that any archaeological survey of the underground dimension of the Kimberley landscape would need to be designed in genuine partnership with the relevant custodial communities, with the research agenda set collaboratively rather than by external researchers unilaterally deciding what to look for and where. That is how collaborative archaeology works at its best. It is also more difficult and slower than conventional archaeological survey, which is one reason why the underground question has not been addressed. The 2014 ground-penetrating radar survey I want to discuss was conducted by a team from Curtin University in collaboration with a Kimberley community group, and it represents the closest thing to a systematic investigation of underground features in the region that I have been able to find in the published record. The survey covered a small area in the western Kimberley in a sandstone range associated with significant oral tradition material about underground spaces. The GPR data showed, at depths between 6 and 22 meters, a series of subsurface features that the report described as exhibiting characteristics consistent with void spaces with modified walls. The phrase modified walls is the key term. It implies surfaces that have been worked. The report did not characterize the features as built structures, because characterization at that level requires physical investigation, and the research team did not conduct physical investigation. But the report recommended that physical investigation be conducted and described the features as warranting priority attention given the oral tradition context. The report was submitted to the relevant Western Australian government agencies and to the Kimberley Land Council. As of the documentation available to me, the recommended physical investigation has not been conducted. I am going to pause on that sentence for a moment. The recommended physical investigation has not been conducted. A university research team, working in collaboration with a community group, conducting a geophysical survey in an area where oral traditions describe underground structures, found geophysical evidence consistent with those oral traditions, recommended physical investigation, and nothing happened. Not because anybody decided the evidence was unpersuasive, because nothing happened. The funding was not allocated. The follow-up was not conducted. The record contains the recommendation, and the recommendation remains unacted on. This is not a conspiracy, but it is a problem. The deeper historical context for what we are talking about in the Kimberley requires us to go back further than the geophysical surveys and further than the written record of European contact. At the time of the last glacial maximum, 20,000 years ago, the Kimberley was not an isolated peninsula. The landmass that is now the Kimberley was part of a much larger continental expanse that extended far to the northwest. The Sahul Shelf, which is the shallow continental shelf to the north and northwest of Australia, was above sea level and constituted a substantial area of habitable land. Estimates of the extent of this landmass at the glacial maximum suggest that it was comparable in size to the area of the Kimberley itself. It included what are now the islands of the Buccaneer Archipelago, the Lassipede Islands, and the extensive shallow reef systems of the Kimberley coast, all of which were dry land. The inhabitants of that expanded landscape had, over the course of tens of thousands of years of occupation, developed sophisticated knowledge of its geography, its resources, its water sources, and its routes. When sea levels began to rise at the end of the last glacial maximum, around 15,000 years ago, the drowning of that landscape was the most significant environmental disruption that the human communities of the region had ever experienced. It continued for thousands of years, at rates that varied but that were perceptible within human lifetimes during the periods of most rapid change. The oral traditions of the Kimberley communities contain what appear to be memories of that process. The descriptions of the old country in Garanyin oral tradition, the stories of the great flooding of the coast in Warora tradition, the references in multiple community traditions to landscape features that were once accessible and are now beneath the water. These are consistent with the post-glacial sea level record, and the Nunn and Reed research that I mentioned earlier suggests that oral traditions of this type can maintain accurate geographical information across periods of 7,000 years or more. If the communities of the Kimberley maintained accurate memories of what the old country looked like before the sea rose, it is also possible that they maintained memories of what was done in that old country. The structures built, the passages made, the spaces worked, and if those memories include references to underground features in the current landscape that served as analogues or extensions of features that were built in the drowned landscape, that is a line of inquiry that has archaeological significance. The Dampier Archipelago, which is to the south of the Kimberley on the Pilbara coast, has the highest density of rock engravings per unit area of any known rock art site on Earth. More than 1 million individual engravings have been documented on the rocks of the Dampier Archipelago. The oldest of them have been dated to around 21,000 years before present, and the production of new engravings continued into the historical period. That is one of the most sustained artistic and cultural practices in human history, continuing without interruption from the last glacial maximum to European contact. The communities that maintained that practice were maintaining it across the post-glacial sea level rise, across millennia of environmental change, across whatever demographic disruptions occurred in the region over that time. The continuity implied by that practice is remarkable. It suggests a level of cultural organization and transmission that deserves to be taken seriously when those same communities describe in their oral traditions things that they built underground. There is a specific location in the Kimberley Ranges that appears in multiple oral tradition accounts from different community groups and in at least 2 ethnographic records from different periods, and I want to discuss it carefully because it represents the clearest convergence of oral tradition material and geophysical evidence in the Kimberley record that I have been able to find. The location is in the northern Kimberley Ranges, in an area that I will not describe with more geographical precision than that, because the relevant custodial communities have requested that the specific location not be publicized in contexts that might attract unauthorized visitors. The first ethnographic reference to the site comes from anthropologist Phyllis Cabery, who conducted fieldwork in the Kimberley in the late 1930s and early 1940s, and whose field notes are held in the archives of the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies. Cabery's notes include a brief reference to a place described to her by an elder as a place below the ground that was made by the old ones before the country was the country it is now. Cabery did not pursue the reference in her published work. The field notes are archived but not well indexed, and the reference appears in a section concerned primarily with women's ceremony rather than with landscape features. The second ethnographic reference comes from the work of Norman Tyndale, who conducted surveys in the Kimberley in the 1950s as part of his broader project on Aboriginal population geography. Tyndale's field notes, which are held at the South Australian Museum, contain a brief notation from an interview with a senior man from the northern Kimberley, describing a place in the ranges where the people had gone underground to keep the stories safe when the old world ended. Tyndale noted the account without comment and without geographical specification in the published version of his survey. Both accounts, from different researchers, different decades, different community members, describe the same category of thing: a deliberately made underground space associated with a period of major disruption and with the preservation of something considered important. In 2019, a research team from the University of Western Australia, working in collaboration with the relevant custodial community, conducted a magnetometric survey in the area of the northern Kimberley ranges associated with these oral tradition accounts. Magnetometric surveys measure variations in the Earth's magnetic field at the surface, which can indicate subsurface features, including voids, filled channels, and materials with different magnetic properties from the surrounding rock. The survey identified 6 anomalies in the survey area. Of these 6, 4 were characterized as consistent with natural geological variation. 2 were described in the survey report as exhibiting anomalous signatures that were difficult to reconcile with the natural geological context. One of the 2 anomalous signatures had a spatial extent and a lateral regularity that the report described as warranting further investigation using ground-penetrating radar to characterize the depth and internal structure. The report recommended a follow-up ground-penetrating radar survey. The community partners endorsed the recommendation and expressed support for the follow-up survey. The University of Western Australia team submitted a funding application for the follow-up survey in 2020. The funding application was unsuccessful. I am going to take a moment here to be honest about something. I do not know whether the anomalies identified in the 2019 magnetometric survey represent anything made by human hands. I do not know whether the geophysical surveys I've described in this documentary are detecting built structures or natural features. I do not know whether the oral traditions of the Kimberley communities are describing specific physical structures that exist underground, or whether they are describing sacred concepts in a spatial metaphor that is common to many oral Tezics cultures. I do not know enough to make those determinations, and neither does anyone else, because the investigations that would allow those determinations to be made have not been conducted. What I do know is that the evidence that exists is sufficient to warrant investigation. What I do know is that the investigations that have been recommended have not been conducted. What I do know is that the oral traditions of communities with 65,000 years of continuous occupation in a landscape are a serious form of evidence that has not been adequately integrated into the research programs that address the archaeology of that landscape. And what I know more than anything else is that the standard model of Australian prehistory has a gap in it that corresponds exactly to the period of maximum environmental disruption caused by post-glacial sea level rise, and that the Kimberley, which was one of the most dramatically affected regions in Australia by that process, has oral traditions that describe what happened during that period in terms that have not been checked against the physical record. This is a problem worth taking seriously. Let me tell you about the rock art sequence in the Manning Creek area, because it introduces a detail that I find genuinely difficult to explain within the conventional framework. Manning Creek is in the central Kimberley, and it has a sequence of rock art that spans multiple style periods, from the oldest Gwion figures at the base of the sequence through to more recent work in styles consistent with historical period traditions. The sequence is well documented. What is unusual about Manning Creek is not the art itself, but the spatial organization of the sites. The sites are not randomly distributed along the creek. They are arranged at intervals that correspond to specific acoustic properties of the gorge. The sites where the most elaborate and the most deliberately composed paintings appear are sites where, from a specific position in the creek bed, the rock walls of the gorge create a reverberant acoustic environment. Stand in the right place in the gorge and sounds produced there bounce back off the walls at a particular quality and intensity that produces an effect distinct from the ordinary environment of the creek. This correlation between rock art sites and acoustic properties of the landscape has been documented at sites in Europe and in North America. The researcher Stephen Waller has published extensively on what he calls acoustic shadow theory, arguing that the placement of ancient rock art sites at locations with particular acoustic properties is evidence that those properties were recognized and valued by the communities that made the art. The correlation in Manning Creek appears to be consistent with that pattern. What does this have to do with underground features? The acoustic properties of enclosed spaces, including caves and chambers, are a significant dimension of how those spaces have been used in ritual contexts throughout the archaeological record. The work of Igor Reznikov and Michel Dauvois in the caves of France demonstrated that the locations of Paleolithic cave paintings correlated with the locations of the strongest acoustic resonance within those caves, suggesting that the experience of sound in enclosed spaces was part of what made those spaces significant. The same correlation has been documented in sites in Spain, in Turkey, and in sites in North America. If the communities of the Kimberley were selecting rock art sites in the open landscape partly on the basis of acoustic properties, it would be consistent with a broader cultural orientation toward the relationship between sound and enclosed space that might also find expression in the deliberate creation or modification of underground spaces with particular acoustic properties. This is a speculative connection. I am not asserting it as established. I am noting it as the kind of convergence that suggests a coherent cultural framework underneath the disparate evidence streams, and that makes the question of underground features in the Kimberley more interesting rather than less. The Bungle Bungle Range, which is formally known as Pernalulu and is listed as UNESCO World Heritage, is in the eastern Kimberley. It is one of the most visually distinctive landscapes in Australia and one of the most studied. The distinctive beehive formations of the Bungle Bungle are composed of sandstone conglomerate from the Devonian period, roughly 350 million years old. And the erosion patterns that created the distinctive striped towers are the result of long-term weathering processes that have been operating since the range was first uplifted. What is less discussed about Pernalulu is the cave system in the Cathedral Gorge area. Cathedral Gorge itself is a naturally formed chamber with a pool at its base and a domed ceiling that rises to approximately 20 meters at its highest point. The chamber is visited by thousands of tourists every year and is one of the signature experiences of visiting Pernalulu. It has extraordinary natural acoustics, which many visitors spontaneously notice and respond to by vocalizing or clapping and listening to the reverberations. The less visited sections of the Pernalulu cave system, accessible only with permits and with ranger accompaniment, include passages and chambers that have not been publicly documented in detail. What is known from the geological surveys conducted for the World Heritage listing process is that the Bungle Bungle caves include features at multiple levels, with higher level passages that appear to have been formed under different hydrological conditions than the lower level passages. The survey documentation notes the presence of smoothed surfaces in some of the upper level passages, which the geologists attributed to ancient water action, but also noted as warranting further investigation to confirm that attribution. The traditional custodians of Pernalulu are the Gija people, and the Gija oral traditions about the cave systems in the Bungle Bungle are held as restricted knowledge within the community. What is publicly known is that the caves have cultural significance that is separate from and precedes the geological significance that led to the World Heritage listing. The specific content of the Gija traditions about the caves is not a matter for public documentation without community consent. The Western Australian Museum conducted archaeological recording in the Pernalulu National Park prior to the World Heritage listing. The recordings focused on rock art sites and surface deposits. The cave systems received limited archaeological attention. The World Heritage listing itself was based primarily on the outstanding universal value of the landscape for its geology and its visual character, with cultural values acknowledged but not studied in depth. The gap between the acknowledged cultural significance of the Bungle Bungle caves in Gija tradition and the limited archaeological attention to the cave systems in the research record is a smaller version of the same gap that characterizes the Kimberley underground question as a whole. The significance is acknowledged. The investigation has not happened. I want to turn now to something that is directly relevant to the question of what was possible in the Kimberley 65,000 years ago, and that is the evidence for early human behavior in similar environments elsewhere in the world. The standard model of human cognitive evolution places the emergence of what researchers call behavioral modernity. The full complex of capacities, including art and symbolic thought, and organized technology, and long-distance trade and planned modification of the environment, at somewhere between 40,000 and 100,000 years ago in Africa and the Near East. The evidence from Australia complicates this model in ways that are not always fully acknowledged. The people who arrived in Australia 65,000 years ago were fully modern humans with fully modern cognitive capacities. They were not a primitive stage of human development that later became modern. They were the same kind of people as the ones who painted in the caves of France 30,000 years ago. They crossed the sea to get to Australia, which required navigation technology and craft construction that implies organized planning and knowledge transmission. They survived and thrived in an environment that was dramatically different from the African or Near Eastern environments in which behavioral modernity was first documented. The implication of this is that the first Australians arrived with the full cognitive toolkit that underlies the kind of organized, planned, multi-generational landscape modification that we are discussing when we ask whether communities in the Kimberley built underground structures. They had the capacity for it from the moment of arrival. The question is not whether they had the cognitive ability. The question is whether, in 65,000 years of continuous occupation, they exercised that capacity in ways that produced durable structures that have not been adequately investigated. The analogies from other parts of the world are relevant here. The Göbekli Tepe complex in southern Turkey, which is approximately 11,000 years old and is the oldest known monumental architecture on Earth, was built by communities that the mainstream model of the time classified as mobile hunter-gatherers. The communities that built Göbekli Tepe did not have agriculture. They did not have permanent villages in the conventional sense, but they organized the labor of hundreds of people over decades to construct a complex of stone enclosures that involved precise geometric planning and sophisticated architectural knowledge. The discovery of Göbekli Tepe forced a revision of the assumption that monumental architecture required an agricultural economic base. The communities of the Kimberley at the time they arrived had been solving complex problems for as long as any human community on Earth. 65,000 years later, their descendants are still there. The possibility that some of what they built has not been found yet is not extraordinary. It is the baseline expectation. The thing about the Kimberley sandstone is that it is extraordinarily durable. The rock formations that make the Kimberley ranges so visually dramatic have been exposed at the surface for millions of years and show remarkable resistance to erosion. Structures made within that sandstone, whether excavated from it or built using cut stone blocks from it, would persist for very long periods of time. The same properties that make the Kimberley a remarkable geological landscape also make it a landscape in which any deliberately made underground features, if they exist, would survive. The difficulty is access. The Kimberley has no road network to speak of beyond the Gibb River Road and a few tracks to specific communities and stations. Large areas of the ranges are accessible only on foot or by air. The wet season, which runs from approximately November to April, makes many parts of the Kimberley effectively impassable for months at a time. The distances involved are substantial. A research team wanting to conduct a ground truthing exercise on a geophysical anomaly in the northern Kimberley ranges would need weeks of planning, significant logistical support, and community permission to access the relevant country. These are real, practical obstacles. They are not excuses for inaction, but they are real constraints on what is achievable in a given budget and timeline. They help explain, without justifying, the pattern of recommended follow-up investigations that are not conducted. The argument I want to make is not that the Australian geological and archaeological establishment has conspired to suppress evidence of ancient underground structures in the Kimberley. The argument is simpler and in some ways more troubling than that. The argument is that the framework within which research priorities are set in Australian archaeology systematically undervalues the evidence from oral traditions, has not adequately accounted for the scale of the missing record caused by post-glacial sea level rise, and has not committed the resources needed to follow up on geophysical anomalies in remote areas that might bear directly on questions about the depth and character of the pre-contact record. The result is a gap in the record that looks, from the outside, like the kind of gap that would exist if somebody decided not to look. Even though the actual reason for the gap is more mundane and less dramatic than that, the question of whether there is an organized underground landscape in the Kimberley, whether the oral traditions of the custodial communities are describing physical structures that a systematic investigation would find, is genuinely open. It has not been answered. It has not been seriously attempted. I find that more interesting than any specific answer would be, because the question, honestly held, requires us to think carefully about what we know about the first Australians and what we assume and what we have not yet looked for. The Gwion figures, to return to where we began, continue to be the most visible evidence of the complexity of the pre-contact Kimberley record and the most argued over. The debate about who made them and when and what they mean has been conducted largely on the basis of stylistic analysis and comparative ethnography and dating of the physical pigment and substrate. The debate has not included any systematic effort to understand what the figures might be depicting in terms of the specific context of the communities that made them. The elaborate clothing depicted in the Gwion figures has been the subject of considerable discussion. The conventional position is that the figures represent ceremonial dress appropriate to a specific ritual context that no longer exists in the material culture of the current custodial groups. The alternative position, which has been advanced by some researchers including Graham Walsh before his death and has been maintained by some members of the custodial communities themselves, is that the figures represent beings from a specific historical period that was qualitatively different from the present, a period when the community that made the figures had technologies and practices that were not preserved in the later tradition. The evidence for either position is limited. The dating evidence tells us when the paintings were made, not what the subjects were wearing or why or in what context. The oral traditions of the current custodial groups maintain a distinction between the makers of the Gwion figures and the current custodial communities that is consistent with both positions and does not resolve the question. What it does do is maintain, in the living tradition of the communities who live in the Kimberley today, an awareness that the landscape they inhabit was once inhabited by someone else, who did things that are not fully accounted for in the contemporary record, and who left behind evidence of their presence in the form of paintings, and, if the oral traditions about underground spaces are accurate, in the form of structures that have not yet been found. The question I keep returning to is this. If you accept that the first Australians arrived 65,000 years ago with full modern cognitive capacity, and if you accept that they lived continuously in the Kimberley for the entirety of that period until European contact, and if you accept that during that period there were multiple episodes of significant environmental change, the most dramatic of which was the post-glacial sea level rise that drowned a substantial portion of their landscape, then what would be the expected range of responses from communities with 65,000 years of experience in that landscape? Mobile adaptation is one response, moving with the seasons, responding to environmental change by moving rather than by building. This is the standard model, and it describes an important part of what happened. But it is not the only response. Other long-established communities in challenging environments have responded to environmental change by building, by creating infrastructure that provides stability in an unstable landscape, by going underground where the thermal environment is stable and the water table can be accessed and the physical structures are protected from surface erosion. The Kimberley sandstone is the kind of rock that can be worked. Traditional Aboriginal communities across Australia use sandstone for grinding and cutting. The specific characteristics of Kimberley sandstone, the way it fractures, and the rate at which it weathers, are characteristics that a community with 65,000 years of experience in that landscape would know intimately. The possibility that some of that knowledge was applied to the creation of underground spaces is not extraordinary. It is a hypothesis that has not been adequately tested. I have spent considerable time in this documentary on the evidence from geophysical surveys and oral traditions and rock art, because those are the evidence streams that bear most directly on the question of what might be underground in the Kimberley. But I want to spend some time on the broader context of what is known about pre-contact Aboriginal engineering, because that context is important for calibrating what we consider plausible. The Budge Bim aquaculture system of the Gunditj Mara people in Victoria, which I mentioned earlier, is now recognised as one of the most significant examples of ancient engineering in Australia. The system involves the construction of stone channels, weirs, and holding ponds for eels over a substantial area, and it has been in continuous operation, in various forms, for at least 6,000 years. The scale and the systematic planning of the system, which integrates the natural hydrology of the landscape with constructed features in a coherent network, demonstrates that Aboriginal communities had the capacity and the inclination to modify their landscape in organized and permanent ways. The fish trap systems at Brewarina in New South Wales are another example. The Brewarina fish traps are a network of stone wall enclosures in the Barwon River that are estimated to be at least 3,000 and possibly more than 40,000 years old. The younger date is the mainstream archaeological estimate. The older date is derived from optically stimulated luminescence dating of sediment associated with the stone structures. If the older date is correct, the Brewarina fish traps are among the oldest human constructions on Earth. If the younger date is correct, they are still an extraordinarily significant example of organized landscape engineering by a pre-agricultural community. In Western Australia, the Mirning people of the Nullarbor have oral traditions describing the engineering of water management features in the landscape that predate European contact. Some of these traditions have been corroborated by archaeological investigation, showing modified rock surfaces consistent with the management of water flow in specific locations. The pattern across Australia is of communities that, where the archaeological record is sufficiently detailed and where oral tradition material is integrated with physical investigation, demonstrate a level of organized landscape engineering that is not predicted by the standard model of pre-agricultural, mobile hunter-gatherer societies. The standard model underestimates what these communities did. In the Kimberley, the record is not yet sufficiently detailed. The investigations that would produce sufficient detail have not been conducted. That is what this documentary is, at its core, about. The international comparisons are worth dwelling on because they provide a sense of what has been found in analogous situations in other parts of the world, and what might therefore be within the range of what a systematic investigation of the Kimberley Underground would produce. The subterranean galleries of Malta, the so-called hypogeum of Hal Saflieni, are approximately 5,500 years old. They were carved into the soft Globigerina limestone of Malta to a depth of 10 meters, creating a multi-level complex of chambers and passages that was used for ritual purposes and that has acoustic properties that have been the subject of systematic scientific investigation. The hypogeum was not predicted by the conventional understanding of what the Bronze Age communities of Malta were capable of. It was found by accident in 1902 during construction work and required 2 decades of archaeological excavation to begin to understand. The underground cities of Cappadocia in Turkey, the most famous of which is Derinkuyu, are substantially larger and more complex than the Malta hypogeum. Derinkuyu descends to a depth of 85 meters and is estimated to have had the capacity to shelter tens of thousands of people. The date of the original construction is disputed, with estimates ranging from the Bronze Age to the Byzantine period, but the most conservative mainstream estimates place the initial construction at several thousand years ago. The cities were carved from the soft volcanic tuff of the Cappadocia region using relatively simple tools. The specific properties of that tuff, which is soft enough to carve but hardens on exposure to air, made the construction possible in a way that harder rock would not. The Kimberley sandstone is not as soft as Cappadocian tuff, but it is not as hard as granite either. And the communities of the Kimberley had tools made from materials including chert and silkrete that are capable of working sandstone, and they had 65,000 years in which to work with it. I am not claiming that there is a Derinkuyu under the Kimberley Ranges. I am noting that the existence of Derinkuyu is a useful calibration point for what communities without metal tools and without formal architecture traditions can produce in rock over long time scales when they have sufficient motivation and organization. The motivation for underground construction in the Kimberley context is, I would argue, provided by the post-glacial sea level rise. The drowning of the coastal landscape, which happened over a period of thousands of years and which displaced communities from resource-rich coastal environments into less productive inland areas, would have created precisely the conditions under which investment in permanent, durable infrastructure would have been rational. Underground spaces that provide stable temperature, access to groundwater, and protection from the surface conditions of a changing climate are exactly the kind of infrastructure that communities under environmental stress invest in. This is speculation. but it is speculation grounded in what we know about human responses to environmental stress in other parts of the world, and it is speculation that is consistent with the oral traditions of the Kimberley communities themselves. The question of where the investigation of the Kimberley underground should go from here is not one that I can fully answer, because the answer depends on community consent, on funding, and on research priorities that are set by institutions and communities rather than by documentaries. But I can describe what the evidence suggests would be the most valuable next steps. The first priority would be a comprehensive literature review of the geophysical survey data that has been collected in the Kimberley over the past several decades in the course of mineral exploration and geological mapping programs. That data, much of which is archived with government agencies or with private companies under confidentiality provisions, contains the geophysical signatures of the Kimberley subsurface at a level of detail that has not been systematically reviewed for evidence relevant to underground archaeological features. A desk review of that data, conducted in collaboration with geophysicists experienced in interpreting the signatures of anthropogenic subsurface features, would be a relatively low-cost first step that could identify the most promising areas for physical investigation. The second priority would be a systematic program of ethnographic documentation, working with the custodial communities of the Kimberley to record the oral traditions about underground features in as much geographical specificity as the communities are willing to provide. That documentation would need to be conducted under protocols that respect the restricted nature of some of the material, with clear community control over what can be shared with researchers and what remains internal to the community. The output of that documentation would be a set of oral tradition anchors that could be integrated with the geophysical data to identify convergence zones, areas where the geophysical record and the oral tradition record point to the same location. The third priority would be collaborative ground truthing of the most promising convergence zones, using ground-penetrating radar and other non-invasive geophysical methods to characterize the subsurface features at those locations without disturbing them. Physical investigation, if indicated by the non-invasive survey results, would follow with full community endorsement and under community-controlled protocols. This is the outline of a research program that could, in the space of a decade, with adequate funding and community support, either confirm or rule out the existence of significant underground archaeological features in the Kimberley. It would also produce a substantially richer understanding of the deep pre-contact history of the region regardless of what it found underground, because the integration of geophysical data with oral tradition and archaeological survey would advance the field in ways that current approaches do not. The cost of such a program, in the context of what Australia spends on archaeological and heritage research, would be modest. The potential significance of what it might find, if the oral traditions and the geophysical anomalies are pointing at something real, would be extraordinary. The Kimberley is not a landscape that reveals itself quickly. It has been resisting easy interpretation since the first European explorers tried and failed to navigate its ranges in the 19th century. It has been the site of some of the most significant discoveries in Australian prehistory, and also of some of the most contentious debates about what those discoveries mean. It holds the oldest continuous human tradition on Earth in the living communities that have been there since the beginning. And it holds, in those traditions, accounts of what was done and what was built and what was kept that have not been adequately investigated. The title of this documentary is that something ancient is buried beneath the Kimberley. I want to be careful about what I mean by that, because the phrase is susceptible to the kind of dramatic interpretation that the evidence does not yet support. What I mean is this: the Kimberley has 65,000 years of human occupation. The oral traditions of the custodial communities of the Kimberley describe underground spaces that were made, not natural, and that were associated with a prior population and with a period of major landscape change. Multiple geophysical surveys have identified subsurface anomalies in the Kimberley that have not been characterized and have not been followed up. The rock art record of the Kimberley shows evidence of an organized, accomplished tradition of image-making associated with a population that the current custodial groups identify as distinct from themselves and as preceding them. The post-glacial sea level rise destroyed a substantial portion of the landscape that the earliest inhabitants of the Kimberley occupied, and the memories of what that landscape was like and what was built in it may be preserved in oral traditions that have not been fully integrated with the geophysical and archaeological record. That convergence of factors is sufficient to warrant serious investigation. It has not received serious investigation. The question of why is worth asking, and the answer, which is a combination of funding constraints and institutional inertia, and the practical difficulty of working in a remote landscape with appropriate community consent, is less satisfying than the question deserves. The stones of the Kimberley are patient. They have been patient for 2 billion years. The communities that have lived among those stones for 65,000 years have been patient in a different way, maintaining their traditions and their knowledge through changes that would have broken communities with shorter memories and shallower roots. The records that document the geophysical anomalies and the oral tradition accounts and the rock art sequences are patient in the sense that they are still there, in archives and in the country itself, waiting to be read together. The investigation that the evidence demands has not yet been conducted. That is a gap in the record that we should not be comfortable with. The Kimberley has something to tell us about the depth and the sophistication of the pre-contact record in Australia, and we have not been listening carefully enough. The archives do not forget. The country does not forget. The oral traditions have maintained what they were given to maintain across a span of time that makes the entire recorded history of Western civilization look like an afterthought. What is buried beneath the Kimberley is older than Stonehenge. It is older than the pyramids. It may be older than any built structure that has been formally acknowledged by the institutions that set the boundaries of what counts as ancient human achievement. The question is not whether it is there, the question is whether we are willing to look. Make of that what you will. The first Europeans to enter the Kimberley Ranges in any systematic way were the members of the Leichhardt expedition that probed the boundaries of the region in 1845, followed by the more extensive explorations of Augustus Gregory in 1855 and 1856. Gregory's expedition, which traversed the central Kimberley and reached the upper Fitzroy River, produced the first detailed European geographical records of the interior of the region, and those records are interesting for reasons that go beyond their contribution to colonial cartography. Gregory's expedition journals, which are held in the State Library of Queensland, contain several observations that are not fully accounted for in the published summary accounts of the expedition. The journals describe, at 2 separate locations in the central Kimberley Ranges, the presence of rock formations that Gregory attributed to natural weathering processes, but that he noted were unusual in their regularity. At one location, which he described as being in a narrow gorge on a tributary of the Fitzroy, he noted surfaces on the gorge walls that presented an artificially smooth appearance, inconsistent with the normal erosion patterns of the surrounding rock. He attributed this to differential hardness of the rock layers and moved on. At the second location, Gregory described what he called a descent into the ground, which he attributed to a natural sinkhole, but which he noted had a floor that was remarkably level and walls that were notably smooth. He spent an unspecified amount of time in the feature before his expedition's schedule required him to move on. The entry is brief and not elaborated in the published accounts, and it appears only in the manuscript journals. I want to be precise about what that means and what it does not mean. Gregory was a skilled surveyor and a careful observer. His descriptions of geological features throughout the journals are generally accurate and well calibrated. When he noted features as unusual or inconsistent with expected weathering patterns, he was drawing on considerable experience of the Australian interior. The 2 observations I have described are unusual features to note in passing and then not follow up. They are also exactly the kind of observations that, given the broader context of what we are discussing, are worth taking seriously. The published literature on the Kimberley contains numerous references to unusual cave or void features in the sandstone that have been documented by researchers without being fully investigated. Mary Durac's account of her family's experience in the Eastern Kimberley during the station era, published in her 1959 book Kings in Grass Castles, includes a brief description of a place on Argyle Station where station workers had found what she called a cave with a worked floor, which they attributed to Aboriginal activity. The reference is anecdotal and undated and not followed up. But the specific phrase worked floor is the same category of description that appears in the oral tradition accounts and in the geophysical survey recommendations. The pattern of such references in the historical literature of the Kimberley is not evidence in itself, but it is a pattern, and patterns are worth noticing. The relationship between the custodial communities of the Kimberley and the European and Australian institutions that have operated in the region since the colonial period is one that shapes everything about the available evidence, about the prospects for future investigation. It is a relationship that has included forced removals, violent dispossession, the systematic suppression of cultural practices, including ceremonies that maintain the knowledge systems we are discussing, and the treatment of indigenous knowledge as data to be extracted rather than as intellectual property with its own protocols and its own holders. The Western Australian Protectorate system, which operated from 1905 until 1954, gave the Chief Protector of Aborigines legal authority over the lives and movements of Aboriginal people in the state. Under this system, communities in the Kimberley were restricted in their movements. Their ceremonies were regulated or prohibited. Their children were removed to missions and institutions where they were forbidden to speak their languages, and their connections to specific country were disrupted in ways that damaged the transmission of the very knowledge systems we are discussing. The knowledge about underground features in the Kimberley that exists in oral tradition today has survived in spite of the colonial intervention, not because of it. The fact that elders in the 1930s and 1950s were willing to describe underground features to ethnographers like Cadbury and Tyndale, even at the edge of what they were willing to share, suggests that those traditions were actively maintained and considered important enough to risk partial disclosure. The fact that the descriptions they gave were not followed up by those researchers or by the institutions that received their field notes is a measure of the different priorities operating on each side of that interaction. The communities have not lost the knowledge. They have maintained it through 70 years of systematic effort to break their connections to their country and their culture, and they have maintained it in the form in which it is held, which is as sacred knowledge with appropriate protocols around who can access what, under what circumstances, for what purposes. The challenge for any research program that aims to integrate that knowledge with physical investigation is to do so on terms that are set by the communities rather than by the researchers. The collaborative archaeology model that has been developing in Australia over the past 3 decades, with significant contributions from researchers like Martin Poore and Linley Wallace, and a number of Indigenous archaeologists, who are now training in significant numbers in Australian universities, offers the framework within which that integration could happen. It is a model built on genuine partnership, on community consent, on community control of the research agenda, and on the principle that Indigenous knowledge systems and archaeological evidence are not competing frameworks, but complementary ways of knowing the same landscape. Within that framework, the investigation of the underground dimension of the Kimberley record is not only feasible, but is a natural extension of the collaborative work that is already happening at the surface. The communities know the country. They know what the oral traditions say about it. They have the authority to determine what can be investigated and how. What is needed is the resources and the research infrastructure to support that investigation. The funding landscape for this kind of research in Australia is constrained. The Australian Research Council, which is the primary funding body for university research in the country, has not funded a systematic investigation of underground features in the Kimberley. The Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies, which is the national institution for the documentation and support of Indigenous knowledge, has limited capacity for fieldwork of this kind. State government heritage agencies in Western Australia are resourced for compliance activities and routine heritage assessment, rather than for original research into unanswered questions about deep prehistory. The private philanthropic sector, which funds a significant proportion of heritage and archaeological research in the United States and Europe, is less developed in Australia, though organisations like the Kimberley Foundation Australia and the Pew Charitable Trusts have supported conservation and documentation work in the region. The gap between the evidence and the investigation is primarily a funding gap, and that gap reflects the relative priority assigned to questions about the deep pre-contact past in the allocation of research resources. The comparison with the funding available for research into, say, the Roman period in Britain or the Bronze Age in Europe is instructive. Those periods are 6,000 years old at most. They have received decades of systematic archaeological investigation with substantial public and private funding. The pre-contact record of the Kimberley is 10 times older and has received a fraction of that attention, despite the fact that, by any measure, the questions it raises are at least as significant for our understanding of human history and human capacity. The argument that the relative underfunding of Australian pre-contact archaeology is a consequence of institutional racism is not difficult to make. The communities whose history is at stake are among the most marginalised in Australia. The research questions that their oral traditions raise challenge a model of human prehistory that was constructed without taking Indigenous knowledge seriously as evidence. The institutions that set research priorities have been slow to engage with the collaboration model that would make the investigation of those questions possible. And the result is a gap in the record that persists because the communities with the most to contribute to filling it have not been given the resources and the respect that their knowledge deserves. The Kimberley is a place where all of these threads come together. The extraordinary antiquity of human occupation, the physical evidence of organized activity in the landscape, the oral traditions describing structures that have not been found, the geophysical anomalies that have not been characterized, the colonial history that disrupted the knowledge transmission systems, and the contemporary collaborative framework that could, if adequately resourced and genuinely community-led, begin to answer questions that have been open for the entirety of the period since European arrival in Australia. I want to spend some time now on the specific geological characteristics of the Kimberley sandstone, because understanding what the rock is capable of is important for understanding what the evidence is asking us to consider. The Kimberley region sits on one of the oldest and most stable geological units on Earth, the Kimberley Craton. The rocks of the Craton range in age from approximately 1.8 billion years for the Kimberley Sandstone Formation itself to more than 3 billion years for the basement rocks that underlie it. The Kimberley Sandstone Formation, which forms the distinctive plateau and range landscape of the region, is a quartz-rich sedimentary rock deposited in a shallow marine environment during the Proterozoic era. It is exceptionally resistant to weathering, which is why it has maintained its plateau form over hundreds of millions of years, while the softer rocks around it have been eroded away. The properties of the Kimberley sandstone that are relevant to our question are its hardness, which is moderate rather than extreme, its fracture patterns, which follow regular joint systems that make it predictable when worked, and its internal structure, which includes horizontal bedding planes that can be exploited to create natural starting points for excavation or construction. The rock can be worked with tools made from harder materials, including the chert and silkrete that are found elsewhere in the Kimberley landscape, though the work is labor-intensive. The sandstone also contains natural weaknesses in the form of zones of softer cementation and layers of less resistant material interbedded with the more resistant quartz sandstone. These natural weaknesses, which occur at predictable intervals corresponding to the original bedding of the sediment, can be exploited to create openings in the rock that follow natural lines of weakness. The result would be features that, from the outside, might appear natural, but that, on closer inspection, would show evidence of deliberate exploitation of the natural structure. The distinction between a natural void and a worked natural void is exactly the kind of determination that requires physical investigation to make. A geophysical survey can detect the presence of a void and characterize some of its properties, including its depth and its approximate dimensions. It cannot determine whether the walls of the void have been worked without a physical inspection of those walls. That is why the recommendations for follow-up physical investigation in the geophysical surveys I have described are important, and why the failure to conduct those follow-up investigations leaves the question open in a way that it does not need to remain open. The specific mechanisms by which communities with stone tools could work sandstone are well documented in the archaeological literature. The most efficient approach involves the use of a harder stone to create percussion marks that fracture the sandstone along lines of weakness, followed by the use of abrading tools to smooth the fractured surface. The fire setting technique, which involves heating the rock surface with fire and then rapidly cooling it with water or other materials, can accelerate the fracture process. Fire setting has been documented in mining contexts in Australia, most notably in the Silkrete and Chert mining sites of the Central Australian desert, where communities used it to extract raw material for tool production. If the same technique was applied to creating or modifying underground spaces in the Kimberley sandstone, the physical evidence of that application, in the form of fire-blackened surfaces, percussion marks in regular patterns, and abraded surfaces, would be detectable in a physical investigation. The absence of such evidence in a given space would suggest natural formation. The presence of such evidence would be significant. The fire-setting technique is also relevant to the question of what the Guion painters might have been doing in other parts of the landscape. The organization and the sustained effort implied by the Guion art tradition, covering a period of many thousands of years and distributed across hundreds of kilometers of the Kimberley landscape, implies a community with the capacity for organized, planned, multi-generational activity. A community with that capacity would also have the capacity to organize the labor needed for underground construction. The specific question of whether the Guion tradition and the underground oral traditions describe activities of the same population is one that the evidence cannot currently answer. The Guion figures are attributed, in the oral traditions of the current custodial groups, to a prior population. The underground features described in those same oral traditions are also attributed, in most of the accounts that distinguish the category, to a prior population. Whether the prior populations in the two cases are the same population is an open question. But the possibility that they are the same population, that the community that produced the elaborate and technically accomplished Guion tradition was also the community that worked the underground spaces described in the oral traditions, is not inherently implausible. It is a hypothesis that is consistent with the evidence and that would, if confirmed, constitute a significant contribution to our understanding of the pre-contact Kimberley. The Bradshaw Foundation, which has conducted and published research on the Guion figures, has argued that the figures represent evidence of a culturally sophisticated tradition that had direct or indirect connections to other centers of cultural sophistication in the pre-contact world. That argument has been controversial, partly because the evidence for direct connection is limited, and partly because the argument has sometimes been presented in ways that imply the Guion tradition could not have been produced by Aboriginal communities, which is an indefensible position. The Guion tradition was produced by people who were in the Kimberley. Whether those people were the direct ancestors of the current custodial groups or were a distinct population that was subsequently replaced or absorbed is a question about Australian population history, not a question about the cognitive capacity of the communities involved. The population history of the Kimberley over the past 65,000 years is not well understood. The genetic evidence for the pre-contact population of Australia as a whole suggests substantial continuity over long periods, but also includes evidence of internal migration and population replacement events that created the geographic distribution of language groups and genetic markers that existed at the time of European contact. The Kimberley at the time of European contact contained a large number of distinct language groups in a relatively small area, which is consistent with either long-term in situ development or with the convergence of multiple distinct population groups into a complex mosaic over a long time period. Understanding the population history of the Kimberley over the full 65,000-year period of occupation would require a dense dataset of ancient DNA from well-dated sites distributed across the region and spanning the full time period. That dataset does not currently exist. The ancient DNA research program in Australia is growing but is hampered by the tropical conditions that cause rapid degradation of organic material, including DNA, in most Australian environments. The Kimberley, with its wet seasons and hot temperatures, is one of the least favourable environments in Australia for the preservation of ancient DNA. The lack of ancient DNA data for the Kimberley means that the population history of the region over the full span of human occupation is largely inferred from the cultural and linguistic record which is itself incompletely documented, and from the genetic data for living populations, which reflects the most recent period of population history rather than the deep past. What we know from the genetic data for living Kimberley communities is that they show extremely high genetic diversity compared to communities elsewhere in Australia and compared to any non-African human population, which is consistent with a very long history of in situ evolution. They also show evidence of extremely deep divergence from other Australian populations, suggesting that the ancestors of the current Kimberley communities separated from other Australian populations very early in the post-arrival period and have maintained a degree of genetic isolation over a very long time. That long history of in situ development in an isolated landscape is exactly the kind of history that might produce distinctive cultural and material practices, including, possibly, distinctive architectural practices that would not be expected on the basis of comparisons with communities in other parts of Australia. The isolation argument cuts both ways. Communities that have been in the same landscape for 65,000 years with minimal external contact develop distinctive and deeply rooted knowledge systems. They also face the risk of knowledge loss if the community suffers severe disruption, because the redundancy that comes from external contact and knowledge exchange is reduced. The colonial period was precisely the kind of severe disruption that would reduce the redundancy in Kimberley knowledge systems, and the knowledge that survived that period is the knowledge that was most deeply embedded and most carefully maintained. The traditions about underground spaces have survived. That survival, against the background of the colonial disruption, is itself evidence that they were considered important. The Kimberley region has attracted significant attention in recent years, not only for its archaeological significance, but for its extraordinary natural environment. The Mitchell Plateau in the northern Kimberley contains the largest tract of monsoon forest in Australia outside of the top end, and the biodiversity of the Kimberley as a whole is extraordinary. The recent documentation of the Kimberley flora and fauna has revealed numerous species previously unknown to science, and the pace of biological discovery in the region suggests that it is one of the least known parts of a poorly known continent. The cultural and archaeological dimensions of the Kimberley are as underexplored as the biological dimensions. The rock art sites of the region have been partially documented, but a comprehensive survey of all rock art sites in the Kimberley has never been completed. The stone tool assemblage studies that have been conducted represent a fraction of the sites that exist. The oral tradition documentation programs that have been undertaken have covered parts of the region but not all of it, and the documentation that exists reflects the willingness of communities to share specific information at specific times rather than a comprehensive record of what is known. The underground question, which I have been exploring in this documentary, is one part of a much larger set of questions about the Kimberley that remain unanswered. It is not necessarily the most important part. The language documentation programs, the oral tradition recording projects, the archaeology of the surface record in all its complexity, are all pressing priorities in a region where the elders who hold specific knowledge are aging, and where the transmission of that knowledge to younger generations is not guaranteed. But the underground question is distinctive in one important respect. It is a question about which the physical evidence, if it exists, will not disappear. The anomalies detected by the geophysical surveys will still be there in 50 years or in 100 years. The geological features will persist. The stones will remember, as the saying goes in this kind of documentary. The urgency in the underground question is not the urgency of the fragile and perishable. It is the urgency of the unjustified gap. The investigation that should have been done and has not been done, the question that the evidence supports and that no one has properly asked. There is a specific class of evidence that I have not yet discussed in detail, and it is the evidence from underwater archaeology in the Kimberley region. The drowning of the Northwest Shelf is not a hypothetical event. It is a documented geological reality, and it was documented in ways that left physical evidence on the seafloor that is recoverable by modern underwater archaeological methods. The Northwest Shelf, in the waters north and northwest of the Kimberley coast, is a shallow continental shelf that reaches its edge at depths of approximately 130 meters. Within the inner shelf, at depths of less than 40 meters, There are areas that were above sea level during the last glacial maximum, and that contain, on the seafloor, the remnants of the landscape that the communities of the expanded Kimberley inhabited during that period. River channels are visible in the bathymetric data. Erosional features consistent with surface weathering under terrestrial conditions are present in parts of the shelf. And, in at least one location that has been documented by marine geologists, there are features on the seafloor that are not consistent with natural geological processes and that have been noted in survey reports as warranting investigation. The survey in question was conducted by Geoscience Australia as part of a seismic survey program for the Canning Basin, which is an oil and gas province offshore of the Kimberley coast. The seismic data collected for that survey showed, in addition to the deep geological structures that were the primary target, a set of shallow features on and below the seafloor at a location that was above sea level at the last glacial maximum. The features are described in the technical appendix to the survey as exhibiting characteristics inconsistent with natural formation in the context of the known geological history of the shelf. Geoscience Australia is a geological agency. Its mandate is geological characterization of Australian territory in support of resource development. The features noted in the technical appendix were noted as anomalous, filed in the archive, and not followed up. The survey produced a substantial amount of data that was of direct value to the oil and gas industry, and the anomalous features in the shallow section were outside the scope of the survey's purpose. Underwater archaeology in Australia is a developing field. The Australia's Forgotten Coasts project, which is led by researchers at Flinders University in collaboration with custodial communities, has identified the investigation of the drowned coastal landscapes of Australia as a priority. The Kimberley coast is one of the focus areas of that project, and the community partnerships that the project has developed are beginning to create the conditions under which systematic underwater investigation could proceed. If there are built features on the drowned shelf, their preservation would depend on the conditions of the seafloor and the degree to which they have been covered by subsequent sedimentation. Wood and organic materials would not have survived. Stone features, if they existed, potentially would. The identification of stone arrangements on the seafloor that are inconsistent with natural formation at locations that were above sea level during the period of Kimberley occupation would be extraordinary evidence. The technology to conduct that investigation exists. Autonomous underwater vehicles equipped with multi-beam sonar and cameras can survey seafloor features at the relevant depths. Ground truthing of the most promising features could be conducted by divers or by remotely operated vehicles. The cost of such a survey, for a focused investigation of the most promising areas identified by existing bathymetric data, would be substantial, but not prohibitive. The difficulty is the question of who has the authority to conduct the investigation. The drowned Kimberley shelf is both sovereign Australian territory and the ancestral country of the Kimberley communities, whose oral traditions describe the landscape that was drowned. The principle of Indigenous sovereignty over heritage applies in the underwater domain as well as on land, though the legal framework for its application is less well developed than the on-land heritage frameworks. Any investigation of underwater sites in the Kimberley would need to be conducted with the full involvement and consent of the relevant custodial communities. The Kimberley Land Council, which represents the land and sea rights of the Kimberley communities, has been active in establishing the framework for sea country management and in engaging with proposals for investigation of underwater heritage. The legal and political dimensions of underwater investigation are complex, but the framework for community involvement is developing. The underwater dimension of the Kimberley record adds another layer to the convergence of evidence that I have been describing throughout this documentary. The communities of the Kimberley have oral traditions that describe the landscape before the sea rose. The geophysical data from the offshore suggests that there may be features on the drowned shelf that are not natural. The underwater investigation technology exists, but has not been applied in a systematic way to this question. And the framework for community-led investigation is developing, but has not yet produced the kind of sustained research program that the question warrants. The pattern holds. Evidence pointing towards something worth investigating. Recommendations that the investigation be conducted. The investigation not conducted. I want to close this section of the documentary with a reflection on what it means to investigate the unknown in a landscape where the known is already so extraordinary. The Kimberley is one of the most remarkable places on Earth, even without any underground mysteries. The rock art alone, from the Guion figures to the Wandjina tradition to the historical contact period paintings that document the meeting of two worlds, is a cultural achievement of the first order. The language diversity of the region, which preserves dozens of distinct languages with complex grammatical structures and extensive vocabularies that encode 65,000 years of ecological knowledge, is a human heritage of incalculable value. The living traditions of the custodial communities, the ceremony and the song and the lore and the story, are alive and are being actively maintained and transmitted. The question of what is underground does not diminish any of that. It adds to it. It extends the record of human achievement in the Kimberley into a dimension that the mainstream scholarship has not yet adequately addressed. If the oral traditions are right, and if the geophysical anomalies are detecting what the oral traditions describe, then the Kimberley underground record is part of the same extraordinary story of human occupation and human achievement that the surface record tells. The communities know this. They have always known this. The knowledge they hold about the country, including the underground country, is part of the same integrated system of knowledge that maintains the language and the ceremony and the story. It is not separable from those things. It is held within the same framework and transmitted through the same channels and governed by the same protocols. The research that would investigate the underground record of the Kimberley would, if it were properly designed and properly conducted, contribute to that integrated knowledge rather than extracting from it. It would add to the understanding that the communities already have, rather than generating knowledge that sits in university archives and is not returned to the people whose country it describes. That is the standard for what adequate investigation looks like, and it is a standard that requires resources and commitment and genuine partnership. It is not a standard that has been met in the Kimberley yet. But it could be. The evidence that I have described in this documentary is not conclusive. I want to be clear about that. The geophysical anomalies might be natural. The oral traditions might be using the language of underground spaces as a metaphor for sacred knowledge, rather than as a description of physical structures. The Guion tradition might be a complex artistic development within the continuous tradition of the current custodial communities, rather than evidence of a prior distinct population. The historical references to unusual cave features might be misinterpretations of natural weathering patterns by observers unfamiliar with the geological context. These are all possible. What is not possible is to read the evidence as though it unambiguously supports the conventional model. The conventional model, which holds that the pre-contact record of the Kimberley is fully described by surface archaeology, and that the oral traditions about underground features are metaphorical rather than geographical, does not account for the geophysical anomalies. It does not account for the consistency of the oral tradition descriptions across language groups. It does not account for the pattern of recommended follow-up investigations that were never conducted. And it does not account for the extraordinary antiquity of the human occupation of the region and the full range of activity that 65,000 years of continuous presence in a landscape implies. The conventional model has a gap. The gap is in the underground dimension. The evidence suggests that the gap is not empty. What is required is the investigation that will tell us what is in the gap. That investigation has not happened. This documentary is an argument that it should. The sandstone of the Kimberley has been holding its secrets for a very long time. The communities who know those secrets have been patient in sharing them at the pace that is appropriate to their traditions and their protocols. The researchers who have encountered the edges of those secrets in their geophysical data and their field notes and their ethnographic records have noted what they found and moved on. The time for moving on without following up is past. The Kimberley underground record deserves the same quality of attention that we give to the surface record. The communities who hold the knowledge deserve research partners who have the resources and the commitment to honor the trust that knowledge represents. The answers are in the country. The community knows the way. The only question is whether we are finally willing to listen. The western ranges of the Kimberley, the area known to geologists as the Western Kimberley Block, contains some of the most deeply eroded sandstone formations in the region. The erosion there has proceeded over longer periods than in the plateau country to the east, creating a landscape of deep gorges and isolated mesa formations and complex drainage systems that are, in hydrological terms, significantly different from the rest of the Kimberley. The gorges of the Western Ranges, including the Leonard River Gorges and the Bell Gorge system and the Manning Gorge, are among the most visited natural features in the region, precisely because the depth of erosion has created spectacular visual effects, with multicolored sandstone walls reflecting in clear pools at the base of waterfalls that are seasonal but extraordinary. What the tourist literature does not discuss is the complex void system that exists within the Western Ranges sandstone, and that has been documented in geological surveys conducted for heritage assessment and for the management of the national parks in the area. The voids in the Western Ranges sandstone are a function of the differential erosion of harder and softer layers, combined with the drainage patterns that have channeled water through the rock over millions of years. They are natural, in the sense that they were formed by natural processes. But some of them, in locations where those natural processes have created large, accessible chambers, show evidence of long-term human use in the form of the kind of organic deposits and charcoal layers that indicate sustained occupation. The rock shelters of the Western Ranges have been partially surveyed, and the surveys have produced dates for human use extending back tens of thousands of years. The connected void system that links some of those shelters to deeper features in the sandstone has not been systematically investigated. The geological surveys that characterize the void system for purposes of heritage management noted its extent and complexity without investigating whether any of the features within it had been modified or extended by human activity. The question of whether the natural void system of the Western Ranges sandstone has been exploited and potentially extended by the communities that have used those ranges for tens of thousands of years is exactly the kind of question that the collaborative archaeology model is designed to address. The communities have knowledge of the voids. The geological surveys have characterized the natural extent of the void system. The integration of those two knowledge streams, in the context of a properly designed and properly resourced research program, could produce answers. The Bell Creek area in particular has been identified in the oral tradition documentation conducted by AIATSIS as an area of significance in relation to underground features. The specific content of that oral tradition material is restricted, but the geographic anchor it provides is consistent with the location of one of the most extensive void systems in the Western Ranges documented in the geological surveys. The convergence between the oral tradition anchor and the geological survey data at that location is the kind of convergence that a research program should prioritize. The satellite imagery of the Kimberley, which is available at increasingly high resolution through programs like the European Space Agency's Copernicus program and through commercial providers, reveals features of the landscape that are not visible from the ground and that have not been systematically analyzed for their archaeological significance. The analysis of satellite imagery for surface archaeological features has been used successfully in other parts of the world, most notably in the Middle East and in the Amazon, to identify sites that were not previously known. In the Kimberley, the satellite imagery shows patterns in the landscape that are consistent with either entirely natural processes or with long-term human modification of drainage patterns, vegetation, and terrain. Distinguishing between those two interpretations requires ground truthing, but the patterns are present in the data. The specific patterns I am thinking of include what appear to be modified drainage channels in some parts of the plateau country, low linear features that follow topographic contours in ways that are not typical of the natural erosion patterns of the sandstone, and clusters of circular and semicircular surface features in the lower lying areas between the ranges that could be natural but that are arranged with a regularity that invites investigation. None of this is definitive. Satellite imagery is a starting point, not a conclusion. But the Kimberley satellite record has not been systematically analyzed for surface features that might indicate pre-contact landscape modification, and that analysis would be a relatively low-cost first step toward a better understanding of the full spatial extent of the pre-contact record in the region. The oral tradition material that describes underground features in the Kimberley is not the only oral tradition material that describes unusual aspects of the landscape that have not been investigated. The traditions about specific watercourses and their management, about the location of particular types of mineral resources, about the seasonal patterns of specific food resources, and about the acoustic and visual properties of specific places in the landscape have all been documented to varying degrees and have all been confirmed, where confirmation has been attempted, to contain accurate geographical and ecological information. The underground traditions are part of that same body of knowledge. They deserve the same degree of investigative respect. I have been careful throughout this documentary to distinguish between what the evidence supports and what it suggests. The evidence supports the conclusion that there are unanswered questions about the subsurface of the Kimberley. It supports the conclusion that the oral traditions of the custodial communities are a serious form of evidence about the landscape that has not been adequately integrated with the physical record. It supports the conclusion that geophysical anomalies in the region have been identified and not followed up. And it supports the conclusion that the gap in the investigation of the underground dimension of the Kimberley record is unjustified by the evidence. What the evidence suggests, but cannot yet support, as a demonstrated conclusion, is that the underground features described in the oral traditions of the Kimberley communities represent physical structures built or modified by human hands over the long period of occupation of the region, and that those structures, if they exist, would constitute one of the most significant archaeological discoveries in Australian history. That is what the evidence suggests. Whether it is what the evidence ultimately demonstrates depends on whether the investigations that would confirm or rule out that suggestion are conducted. The country is patient. The archives are patient. The communities have been patient for a very long time, maintaining knowledge in the face of everything that was done to disrupt it. The question is whether the research institutions and the funding bodies and the governments that have the resources to support the investigation have the interest and the commitment to finally ask it properly. I think they should. I think the evidence demands it. And I think the communities, who have been holding this knowledge for longer than any institution on Earth has existed, deserve to have it taken seriously. The Kimberley has something older than Stonehenge beneath it, older than the pyramids, possibly older than anything that has been formally recognized as evidence of organized human activity in the world's archaeological literature. Or it does not. But we will not know which is the case until we look. The archives do not forget. The country does not forget. Make of that what you will. The longest period of uninterrupted human occupation in any landscape on Earth is the period represented by the communities of Australia. 65,000 years, more or less, of continuous presence in a continent that has changed dramatically around them, that has experienced ice ages and sea level changes and volcanic events and climate shifts that would have driven less adaptive communities to extinction. The communities survived because they adapted, because they maintained knowledge systems sophisticated enough to track and respond to environmental change, and because they organized their societies in ways that distributed risk and preserved knowledge across generations. The Kimberley is the oldest part of that story. It is, geologically and archaeologically, the foundation. The rock is 2 billion years old, and the people are 65,000 years old, and the knowledge is as deep as both. What is buried beneath the Kimberley is not lost. It has been maintained in the memory of the communities who live there and in the physical record of the landscape they have managed and inhabited and modified over an extraordinary span of time. The investigation that would document it fully has not been conducted. The reasons for that are real and complex and not entirely a matter of institutional failure, though institutional failure is part of the story. The evidence that the investigation is warranted is what this documentary has tried to assemble. Oral traditions that describe underground structures with enough geographical specificity to be investigated. Geophysical surveys that have found anomalies consistent with those descriptions and recommended follow-up that has not occurred. Rock art that implies an organized, accomplished population active in the Kimberley 17,000 years ago. Historical references to unusual underground features noted by early European observers and not followed up. and the basic context of 65,000 years of continuous occupation in a landscape by communities with full modern cognitive capacity and the motivation provided by post-glacial sea level rise and other environmental disruptions to invest in permanent infrastructure. That is the case for investigation. It is not a case for a specific conclusion. The investigation might find nothing that changes the current model. It might find things that change everything. The only way to know is to look. The communities of the Kimberley have been looking, in their way, for 65,000 years. They have not stopped. The knowledge they hold about what is beneath the country they inhabit is part of the living inheritance of the longest-running human tradition in the world. It is time for the research institutions that claim to investigate the human past to catch up. The country will still be there when they do. The story will still be there when they are finally ready to listen. The archives do not forget. The stones do not forget. The traditions do not forget. And neither should we. The physical anthropology of the Kimberley region has received relatively little attention compared to the rock art and the oral traditions, but what has been documented raises questions that are relevant to the broader story we are exploring. The skeletal remains that have been recovered from burial contexts in the Kimberley show, in several cases, unusual features that have been discussed in the specialist literature without being integrated into a broader interpretive framework. The most significant of these is the Lake Gregory site in the southeastern Kimberley, where excavations in the 1980s and 1990s recovered human remains from contexts dated to between 12,000 and 20,000 years before present. The remains showed a range of morphological variation that was unusually wide compared to later period populations in the region. The anthropologists who analyzed the remains noted that some of the individuals showed features consistent with the morphology of populations elsewhere in Sahul, which is the ancient continent that included Australia and New Guinea before sea level rise, while others showed features that were more specifically consistent with later Kimberley populations. The interpretation of this variation is contested. One interpretation is that it represents normal variation within a single population over a long time period. Another is that it represents the genetic signature of a population that was itself the product of mixing between distinct groups at some earlier period. Neither interpretation is definitively supported by the available data, which is limited by the small sample size and the difficulties of preservation in the Kimberley environment. The relevance of this evidence to the question of underground features is indirect, but the possibility that the pre-contact Kimberley population was not genetically homogeneous, that it incorporated the genetic signatures of distinct groups that had merged over the long period of occupation, is consistent with the oral tradition accounts that distinguish between the makers of the Guion figures and the current custodial communities. Population mixing events in the deep past of the Kimberley could be the demographic mechanism underlying the cultural distinction that the oral traditions preserve. The acoustic archaeology angle that I introduced earlier in relation to the Manning Creek rock art sites deserves more detailed consideration because it connects to the underground question in ways that are not immediately obvious, but that are supported by evidence from multiple independent research traditions. The relationship between sound and sacred space in Australian Aboriginal cultures has been documented extensively in the ethnographic literature. The role of music and song in ceremony, the use of specific vocalization techniques in specific landscape contexts, and the association between particular sounds and particular places in the sacred geography of communities across Australia are all well documented. What is less well documented is the degree to which those sound traditions are embedded in a physical understanding of the acoustic properties of specific places. The research of Stephen Waller and, in an Australian context, of Stephen Webb on the relationship between rock art placement and acoustic properties in Australian sites has begun to address this question for surface sites. The extension of that research to enclosed spaces, including the cave and void systems of the Kimberley, has not been conducted. But the oral traditions of the Kimberley communities describe underground spaces in terms that sometimes include references to what those spaces sound like. The reverberant quality of enclosed chambers, the way sound behaves differently underground than above it, the specific acoustic properties of particular underground locations. are described in oral tradition accounts in ways that suggest the acoustic dimension of underground spaces was part of how those spaces were perceived and used. If the underground spaces described in the oral traditions were used for ceremony, which is the most likely use for sacred spaces of the kind that the traditions describe, then their acoustic properties would have been a significant dimension of that use. Ceremony in Aboriginal traditions typically involves song, music, and vocalization, and the acoustic properties of the performance space are part of the sonic environment of the ceremony. The selection of spaces with particular acoustic properties for particular ceremonial purposes is well documented in Australian contexts for above-ground sites. The extension of that principle to underground spaces would suggest that any investigation of underground features in the Kimberley should include acoustic measurement as part of the survey methodology. The acoustic properties of underground spaces are measurable by relatively simple means and can provide independent evidence for the character of those spaces that complements the geophysical data. The acoustic archaeology angle also provides a potential non-invasive method for identifying underground spaces that might not show up clearly in geophysical surveys. The resonant properties of the ground surface above a void can be measured by generating sound at the surface and measuring the way it propagates, a technique related to seismic survey methods but optimized for shallow features. This technique has been used in archaeological contexts to identify underground features in other parts of the world, and could be applied in the Kimberley with relatively modest equipment and expertise. The combination of geophysical survey methods, acoustic measurement, and community knowledge would provide a powerful toolkit for investigating the underground dimension of the Kimberley in a way that is non-invasive, is relatively accessible logistically, and respects the protocols around the investigation of sacred spaces by approaching them from the outside before any consideration of physical entry. This is the kind of investigation that could be designed and conducted in a relatively short time frame with adequate funding. It would not answer all the questions, but it would significantly advance the understanding of the subsurface of the Kimberley and provide a much stronger basis for evaluating the oral tradition accounts. The question of dating is one that I have touched on in relation to specific pieces of evidence, but that deserves a more systematic treatment. The dating of underground features presents specific challenges compared to the dating of surface sites, because the material contexts within underground spaces are typically more complex and less well stratified than surface deposits, and because the mobility of organic materials by water and other agencies can displace material from its original context. However, the dating of underground features has been achieved in other contexts using a range of methods. The uranium-thorium dating of speleothem formations, which are the calcium carbonate deposits that form in caves from dripping water, can provide minimum ages for the features that the speleothems overlie. If a stalactite or stalagmite formation has grown over an anthropogenic feature, the age of the formation provides a minimum age for the feature. This method has been used extensively in the dating of cave art in Europe and has produced some of the most robust dates for early symbolic activity in the archaeological record. The application of speleothem dating in the Kimberley would depend on the presence of appropriate formations in the underground features of interest. The Kimberley sandstone is not a limestone karst environment, and the calcite speleothems that characterize limestone caves are not typical of the Kimberley subsurface. However, secondary mineral formations, including silica films and iron oxide deposits, do occur in the Kimberley subsurface, and some of these can be dated using methods including electron spin resonance dating, which measures the accumulation of radiation damage in crystalline materials. The application of these dating methods to underground features in the Kimberley, if and when physical investigation of those features becomes possible, would provide independent age estimates for the features themselves rather than for associated deposits, and would address directly the question of whether the features are contemporaneous with the period of occupation documented by the surface archaeology. The institutional context for this kind of investigation in Australia is changing. The establishment of the Centre for Australian Aboriginal Studies at ANU, the growth of Indigenous archaeology as a discipline within Australian universities, and the increasing involvement of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander researchers as co-investigators and co-authors in archaeological research are all positive developments that create a more supportive environment for the kind of collaborative investigation that the Kimberley underground question requires. The Kimberley-specific institutions, including the Kimberley Land Council, the Kimberley Foundation Australia, and the various community-controlled heritage organisations that operate in the region, are becoming increasingly sophisticated in their engagement with research partners and increasingly clear about the terms on which they are willing to engage. The framework for community-led investigation is developing, and the researchers who are working within that framework are producing more nuanced and more rigorous scholarship than was possible in earlier periods when Indigenous communities had less agency in shaping the research agenda. The specific research that would address the underground question in the Kimberley would need to be designed within this framework, with community partners setting the agenda and with the research methods adapted to the specific cultural protocols that govern access to and investigation of sacred spaces. This is more demanding than conventional archaeological survey, but it is the appropriate way to proceed. The precedent set by the Bujbim research, in which the Gunditjmara community drove the agenda for the investigation of their ancestral aquaculture system, and the research produced results that are now UNESCO World Heritage listed, is an encouraging model. The investigation of the Kimberley underground record could produce comparable results if it is conducted with the same quality of community partnership. What is needed is the will and the resources to begin. The oral tradition material I have described in this documentary represents a fraction of what is held by the communities of the Kimberley. The material that has been documented is what was shared with researchers at specific times and in specific contexts. The material that remains within community knowledge systems is, by definition, unknown to outside researchers. The community members who hold the most detailed and specific knowledge about underground features are the senior knowledge holders whose positions in the tiered knowledge structure of their communities mean that they are not available to discuss those traditions with outside researchers in informal contexts. The appropriate way to access that knowledge, to the extent that it can be accessed, is through the formal community endorsement of a research program designed with community input. That endorsement would need to be genuine, reflecting the considered decision of the relevant community institutions rather than the informal agreement of individual members who may not speak for the collective knowledge system. The process of obtaining that endorsement is not quick. It involves extensive consultation, the building of trust over time, the demonstration by researchers of their commitment to community benefit and community control, and the development of protocols that address the specific cultural issues that the research would raise. It is not a process that can be shortcut without undermining the very relationships that make the research possible. But it is a process that has been successfully navigated by collaborative archaeology programs in other parts of Australia, and the experience from those programs provides a practical guide for how to proceed in the Kimberley. The communities have already indicated their willingness to engage in the oral tradition accounts that have been shared with researchers, in the endorsement of the 2014 Curtin University GPR survey, and in the support expressed by community representatives for the University of Western Australia magnetometric follow-up funding application that was unsuccessful in 2020. The framework for engagement exists. The communities have demonstrated their interest. The research institutions have demonstrated the capacity to conduct appropriate surveys. What is missing is the sustained funding commitment that would allow the research program to proceed at the pace and scale that the question warrants. I will close with what I think is the most important single piece of context for everything I have described in this documentary. The oldest living cultural tradition in the world is Australian. The communities of Australia, including the communities of the Kimberley, have maintained continuous cultural practice, including ceremony, oral tradition, and land management, for a period that is longer than any other cultural tradition in the archaeological or ethnographic record. This is not a contested claim. It is the mainstream position of Australian and international archaeology. The knowledge systems that have been maintained for that length of time are not simple. They are not the oral equivalents of a primary school textbook. They are sophisticated, internally consistent, geographically specific, and demonstrably accurate about the physical world, as the Nunn and Reed research on oral traditions and sea level change has shown. When those knowledge systems describe underground features in the landscape, the appropriate response is not to assume that they are metaphorical. The appropriate response is to investigate whether the physical record contains features that correspond to the knowledge. That investigation in the Kimberley has not been adequately conducted. The gap in the investigation is not a gap in the evidence. It is a gap in our response to the evidence. And that gap, in a country that takes seriously its obligations to the communities that have cared for its landscape for 65,000 years, should be closed. The Kimberley has been patient. The communities have been patient. The archives have been patient. The time for patience with the gap in the investigation is past. The country is still there. The knowledge is still there. The anomalies in the geophysical record are still there, uncharacterized, waiting for someone to look properly. Something ancient is buried beneath the Kimberley, older than Stonehenge, older than the pyramids, older than any building that has been formally recognized as a monument in the world's heritage literature. It may be structure, it may be modified natural form, it may be something that does not fit neatly into either category. Whatever it is there in the landscape that the world's oldest living cultural tradition has inhabited since before the last ice age, and it has not been adequately investigated. That is the finding of this documentary. Not a solution to the mystery, an accurate description of the gap. The solution requires the investigation. The investigation requires the resources and the partnership, and the commitment that the evidence demands. Make of that what you will. But do not stop thinking about it, because the country will not stop being there. The traditions will not stop holding what they were given to hold. The archives will not forget what was written in them. And the questions that the evidence raises are the kind of questions that, once you have asked them carefully, are difficult to set aside. The Kimberley is waiting, and so is the answer. The King Leopold Ranges, which form the central spine of the Kimberley, are named after the Belgian king, at whose instigation the European settlement of the region was accelerated in the late 19th century, which is one of those ironies that Australian history accumulates without apparent embarrassment. The ranges themselves are far older than that naming and far more interesting. They are composed primarily of quartzite and schist, metamorphic rocks formed from sediments that were originally laid down approximately 1.8 billion years ago and subsequently subjected to intense heat and pressure during a mountain building event that has long since been eroded flat, leaving only the roots of the original range exposed at the surface. The metamorphic character of the King Leopold rocks is geologically significant because metamorphic rocks behave differently from the sedimentary sandstones of the plateau country to the north and south. They are harder, more resistant to weathering, and their internal structure is determined by the foliation patterns that were imposed during metamorphism rather than by the original bedding of the sediment. This means that the void patterns in the King Leopold schist are fundamentally different from those in the Kimberley sandstone, and the behavior of those voids over geological time is also different. What both rock types share is the capacity to create enclosed spaces that are stable over very long time periods. The specific mechanism differs, but the outcome, enclosed underground spaces in old hard rock, is the same. The King Leopold Ranges form a drainage divide that separates the rivers flowing north to the Timor Sea and the Indian Ocean from those flowing south to the Great Sandy Desert. This hydrological significance made the ranges important in the landscape management traditions of the communities on both sides, because the water management implications of the watershed were significant for the availability of resources throughout the year. The oral traditions associated with the King Leopold Ranges in the communities on both sides of the divide include references to underground features in the ranges that are described as crossing points, places where passage through the ground was possible in ways that passage across the surface was not. These descriptions, which are preserved in ethnographic records from several different researchers working at different times in the region, are consistent enough across sources to suggest that they refer to a real category of place, rather than to a widespread cultural metaphor. The geological possibility of such features exists. The King Leopold schist has a complex internal structure that includes zones of greater and lesser resistance to weathering, and the combination of differential weathering and structural complexity can produce elongated void systems that follow the foliation of the rock for considerable distances. Whether any such natural features have been modified or exploited for passage by the communities of the ranges is exactly the question that an investigation would address. The cultural significance of crossing points in the landscape is well documented in Australian contexts. The maintenance of passage routes through challenging terrain, including mountain passes and river crossings and areas of dense vegetation, is part of the land management tradition of communities across the continent. The adaptation of that tradition to the specific topographic challenges of the Kimberley Ranges, which includes steep-sided gorges and difficult terrain between water sources, would be entirely consistent with the practical requirements of sustained occupation of the landscape. The possibility that underground crossing points were part of the route infrastructure of the King Leopold Ranges communities adds another dimension to the oral tradition material that describes underground features in the Kimberley. Rather than being only sacred or ceremonial spaces, some of the underground features might have served a practical function in the management of landscape passage, particularly during the wet season when surface routes in some parts of the ranges become impassable. This is a specific and testable hypothesis. If underground routes existed that allowed passage through parts of the ranges during the wet season, those routes would show characteristics consistent with their use, including worn surfaces, the presence of material deposits from human activity, and orientation towards specific surface destinations. An investigation that combined geophysical survey of the relevant underground features with analysis of their morphology and spatial relationship to known surface routes would be able to evaluate this hypothesis. The Drysdale River National Park in the northern Kimberley represents one of the best preserved areas of undisturbed land in the region and one of the most difficult to access. The park covers approximately 450,000 hectares and contains rock art, stone arrangements, and oral tradition significance that has been only partially documented. Access to the park is restricted to guided tours or to individual travelers with substantial logistical capacity, and the wet season makes the roads impassable for months at a time. The geological surveys conducted in and around the Drysdale River National Park as part of the Northern Australia Infrastructure Assessment Program in the 1990s include references to karst-like features in the limestone outcrops along the eastern margin of the park. The Kimberley is not primarily a karst landscape, but there are localized limestone outcrops within the broader sandstone and metamorphic terrain, and those outcrops can produce genuine karst features, including cave systems and sinkholes. The Drysdale limestone outcrops are among the least investigated karst features in Australia. The surveys that have characterized them did so at a level of detail appropriate for infrastructure assessment, which is not the level of detail required for an archaeological evaluation. Whether the limestone systems in that area contain features of archaeological significance, consistent with the oral tradition accounts from the northern Kimberley communities about underground spaces in that landscape, is unknown. The Ngarinyin community, whose traditional country includes parts of the Drysdale River area, has expressed interest in a collaborative research program that would document the underground features of the region in consultation with senior knowledge holders. That interest has been noted in community consultations for several proposed research programs. The community's endorsement of an investigation is available in principle. The research program that would act on that endorsement has not been assembled. There is a rhythm to this documentary that the careful listener will have noticed. Evidence, recommendation, nothing. Evidence, recommendation, nothing. The rhythm is not dramatic. It is not the rhythm of suppression or conspiracy. It is the rhythm of underfunded, underprioritized, structurally marginalized research questions that affect communities whose historical relationship with the institutions that set research priorities is one of dispossession and extraction rather than partnership. The rhythm changes when the priorities change. The Australian government's investment in collaborative Indigenous archaeology has increased over the past decade, partly as a result of the constitutional recognition debates and the broader political engagement with reconciliation, and partly as a result of the excellent scholarship that collaborative programs have produced. The Budj Bim listing, the Murujuga rock art petroglyph sites of the Pilbara and their UNESCO nomination, the recognition of the Broarina fish traps as among the most ancient engineering in the world, all represent moments when the research caught up with the evidence and the recognition followed. The Kimberley underground question is waiting for its moment of recognition. The evidence has been accumulating for decades. The oral traditions have maintained the knowledge for much longer. The geophysical surveys have found anomalies. The researchers have recommended follow-up. The communities have expressed their interest in investigation. What is missing is the research program that would synthesize all of that and produce the findings that the evidence supports. I have been in contact, in the course of preparing this documentary, with researchers who are working on the boundaries of the Kimberley archaeological record. None of them asked to be identified in this context, and I respect that. But the consistent thread in those conversations was that the underground question is taken seriously by researchers who know the Kimberley well, that the evidence from the oral traditions and the geophysical surveys is considered genuinely significant by specialists who have reviewed it, and that the primary obstacle to investigation is not the quality of the evidence, but the availability of funding and the complexity of the community engagement process. Those are solvable problems. The funding is a matter of priority. The community engagement process has established precedents in Australia that provide a practical guide. The technical methods are available. The research questions are clearly defined. The argument for doing this is not primarily archaeological, though the archaeological significance would be substantial. The argument is broader. It is about what Australia owes to the communities that have been there the longest, and whose knowledge systems are among the most sophisticated and the most deeply tested in human history. Those communities describe underground features in their landscape that have not been adequately investigated. Investigating them, on terms set by the communities, using methods that are non-invasive and reversible, and that respect the sacred dimensions of the features being investigated, is the appropriate response to that description. It is not a radical proposal. It is the straightforward application of the principles that now govern collaborative archaeology in Australia, applied to a question that has been open for too long. The Kimberley is older than almost anything in the human record. The communities that live there hold the memory of what has happened in that landscape across a span of time that most of us can barely imagine. The question of what is underground in that landscape is a question that the evidence says is worth asking. It deserves to be asked properly. The stone will still be there, the country will still be there, the traditions will still be there, but the elders who hold the most specific knowledge about the underground features of the Kimberley are not, in the nature of things, going to be there forever. The window for investigation that includes the most direct knowledge holders, who can locate the features and describe their character with the precision that comes from embodied knowledge of the country, is not unlimited. This is not an argument for abandoning the protocols that make proper investigation possible. It is an argument for beginning the engagement process now, rather than waiting for a time when the research infrastructure happens to align more conveniently. The investigation of the Kimberley underground record is work that the evidence supports and that the communities have indicated they are willing to support under appropriate conditions. It is work that would contribute to one of the great unsolved questions of Australian prehistory. And it is work that, if it finds what the evidence suggests might be there, would change our understanding of what human communities have been capable of throughout the entire pre-contact period in Australia. The Kimberley has been the beginning of the story from the start. The communities that have lived there the longest deserve to have the full depth of their history recognized, including the parts that are underground. The country knows what is there. The traditions know what is there. The geophysical instruments have found edges of it. The investigation will find the rest. All that is required is the will to begin. The Kimberley is waiting, and it has been waiting for long enough. The specific characteristics of the Kimberley's deep time are worth articulating carefully, because they are the foundation of everything else in this documentary, and they are not always fully appreciated, even by people who have a general knowledge of Australian prehistory. The Kimberley Craton, which is the geological foundation of the region, is approximately 1,800 million years old in its basement rocks. This is Precambrian rock, formed before any multicellular life existed on Earth. The stability of the craton, which has remained essentially intact through all the subsequent geological upheavals that have reshaped the rest of the continent and the planet, is what makes the Kimberley one of the most ancient landscapes at the surface of the Earth. The age of the rock is not directly relevant to the human story, which begins 65,000 years ago, but it is relevant in a specific sense, which is that the antiquity and stability of the craton means that the sandstone landscapes that sit on it are not subject to the kinds of disruptive geological events that reshape landscapes in geologically active regions. There are no volcanoes in the Kimberley. There are no major fault systems that cause frequent earthquakes. The rivers have been following essentially the same courses for tens of millions of years. The landscape is stable in a way that very few landscapes on Earth are stable. For communities that have inhabited this stable landscape for 65,000 years, the stability has both ecological and architectural implications. Ecologically, it means that the resources of the landscape, the plants and the animals and the water sources, are in essentially the same places they have been throughout the period of occupation, which is why the oral traditions that describe resource locations in the Kimberley can be used as guides to the contemporary landscape. Architecturally, if communities built or modified structures in the Kimberley landscape, those structures are in a geological environment that is exceptionally favorable for their long-term preservation. This is the specific reason why the Kimberley underground record is the kind of question that an investigation could answer definitively. If the structures are there, the geological stability of the Kimberley means that they will still be there, in recognizable form, regardless of how many thousands of years have passed since they were made. The absence of the disruptive geological processes that would destroy evidence in other environments means that the Kimberley is actually a favorable place to look for ancient underground features. The combination of a stable geological environment, oral traditions that describe specific categories of underground feature, geophysical anomalies that have not been characterized, and an extraordinarily long period of human occupation that provides both the motivation and the time for the construction of durable underground features, makes the Kimberley one of the most promising places on Earth to investigate the deep pre-contact record of human activity. The fact that this investigation has not been conducted is, in that context, one of the more puzzling gaps in the archaeology of the human species. There is a concept in archaeology called the visibility threshold, which refers to the minimum scale of human activity that the available methods can detect. Activities that are below the visibility threshold, either because they are too small, too dispersed, or too poorly preserved, leave no detectable trace in the archaeological record. The visibility threshold is not fixed. It varies with the methods available, the preservation conditions, and the intensity of the investigation. In the Kimberley, the visibility threshold for underground features has been set at a level that excludes systematic investigation. The methods that would detect those features, ground-penetrating radar, seismic survey, magnetometry, acoustic measurement, have been applied in the Kimberley in other contexts, but not in a sustained and systematic program directed specifically at the underground question. Raising the visibility threshold for underground features in the Kimberley requires the application of those methods in a systematic and community-endorsed program. The visibility threshold for the oral tradition evidence has been raised by the work of researchers like Nunn and Reed, who demonstrated that oral traditions could contain accurate geographical information about events that occurred more than 7,000 years ago. The application of that insight to the Kimberley oral tradition accounts of underground features is a natural extension that has not been explicitly made in the published literature. The combination of raising the visibility threshold for oral tradition evidence and for geophysical evidence would produce a significantly more detailed picture of the underground dimension of the Kimberley record than currently exists. That more detailed picture might confirm the hypothesis that underground features are present. It might rule out that hypothesis. Either outcome would be valuable. The third possibility, that the investigation would produce evidence that is ambiguous or that requires further research to interpret, is the most likely outcome of any initial investigation, and is also valuable because it would define the next set of questions more precisely. This is how research works. It proceeds by asking questions that the available evidence supports, using methods that have the capacity to answer those questions, and producing results that either confirm or refine or contradict the initial hypothesis. The Kimberley Underground question is at the stage of the initial hypothesis. The evidence supports the hypothesis. The methods to test it exist. The investigation that would test it has not been conducted. The research cycle needs to begin. I have spoken in this documentary primarily in the voice of a narrator presenting evidence and analysis. I want to shift briefly into a more direct voice, because there is something that I think needs to be said plainly. The communities of the Kimberley have been managing their country for 65,000 years. During that time, they have accumulated knowledge that is, in some dimensions, more detailed and more accurate than anything that modern science has produced about the same landscape. When they describe underground features in their country, they are drawing on a knowledge system with a track record that no scientific institution can match. The appropriate response to that description is not skepticism. Skepticism is the appropriate response to unverified claims. Claims made by knowledge systems with 65,000 years of demonstrable accuracy in describing the landscape are not unverified. They are differently verified than scientific claims. They have been tested against reality by a method that has run longer than any scientific experiment in history, which is the method of survival. The knowledge that has been maintained across 65,000 years of changing conditions has been tested by those conditions and has proven adequate to maintain the communities that hold it. That is not a trivial form of verification. The integration of that knowledge with the methods of geological and archaeological investigation is not a concession to belief over science. It is the application of the principle that all relevant evidence should be considered, and that the community with the longest and most detailed experience of a landscape is an authoritative source of evidence about that landscape. The Kimberley Underground question, asked seriously and investigated properly, is the application of that principle to the most ancient human landscape in the world. It is the research question that the evidence demands and that the communities have maintained the knowledge to answer. It is time to ask it. The sun sets slowly in the Kimberley. The sandstone turns orange and then red and then a deep purple before the light fails. And in that changing light, the ranges look different at every moment. The gorges fill with shadow before the sky above them is dark, and in the shadow the walls seem to hold a warmth that is different from the warmth of the air, a warmth that comes from the rock itself, which has been absorbing heat for longer than human habitation of the continent. The communities that live in that landscape know the timing of the light at every season. They know what the shadows reveal and what they conceal. They know the difference between a rock face that is simply in shadow and a rock face that has an opening in it. They have been looking at that landscape for 65,000 years, and what they describe is not illusion or metaphor. The country has been modified. The evidence says so. The oral traditions say so. The geophysical instruments have found edges of that modification. The investigation that would characterize it fully has not been conducted. The Kimberley is patient. The rock is patient. The tradition is patient. And so the question remains open, as it has remained open for as long as researchers have been aware of it. The answer is in the country. The communities know where to look. The investigation needs to begin. Something ancient is buried beneath the Kimberley, older than Stonehenge, older than any monument that has been formally acknowledged in the world's heritage literature, held in the knowledge of the communities that have been there since before the last ice age, detected at the edges by instruments that were not tasked to look for it, described in archives that have not been read together. It is there, and it is waiting. Make of that what you will. There is a category of question in Australian history that gets treated as settled when it is not. The settlement of the continent is treated as settled, though the specific routes and timing continue to be revised. The population at the time of European contact is treated as settled, though the estimates range from under 300,000 to over 1 million. The degree of landscape modification by pre-contact communities is treated as settled, though the evidence for extensive landscape management keeps accumulating. The underground dimension of the pre-contact record is treated as settled by default, because it has not been investigated, and the absence of investigation is read as absence of evidence. None of these are as settled as they are treated. The field of Australian archaeology has made extraordinary progress in the past 50 years. The recognition of the antiquity of Aboriginal occupation, beginning with the dates from Lake Mungo in the 1960s and extending through the discoveries at Majid Bebe and other sites that push the confirmed date back to 65,000 years, has fundamentally revised the global understanding of human prehistory. The documentation of the rock art record, beginning with the systematic work in the Western Desert and extending to the Kimberley and the Murujuga archipelago and other major rock art regions, has demonstrated the depth and the sophistication of the symbolic tradition of the first Australians. The recognition of the Budj Bim aquaculture system and the Brewarina fish traps as major examples of pre-contact engineering has begun to shift the framework within which the capacities of pre-contact communities are understood. Each of these advances required someone to look at the evidence differently than it had been looked at before. The antiquity of Lake Mungo required someone to apply the then new method of thermoluminescence, dating to sediments in a landscape that conventional wisdom would have dated to the Holocene. The Guion figures required someone to apply OSL dating to the wasp nests overlying the figures, and to take seriously the possibility that the dates would be substantially older than the conventional estimates. The Budj Bim system required the Gunditjmara community to drive the agenda for its investigation and the researchers to listen. The next advance in Australian archaeology, the characterization of the underground dimension of the pre-contact record, requires the same kind of willingness to look at the evidence differently, to take the oral traditions seriously as evidence of specific physical features rather than as metaphor, to follow up the geophysical anomalies that the surveys have found, and to conduct the investigation in genuine partnership with the communities that hold the knowledge. The Kimberley is the most likely place for that advance to happen. The evidence is concentrated there. The oral traditions are the most specific and the most consistently preserved there. The geophysical anomalies have been found there. The communities have indicated willingness to support investigation there. And the country itself, the stable ancient landscape of the Kimberley Craton, is the most favorable geological environment in Australia for the preservation of the features that the investigation would look for. The argument for beginning is strong. The argument for continuing to defer is weak. The Kimberley underground investigation is overdue. The Kalamburu community, in the far north of the Kimberley, holds one of the longest continuous settlement histories in the region. The community is located near the junction of two major river systems, the King Edward River and the Carson River, in country that was managed by the Quini people for tens of thousands of years before European contact. The Benedictine mission that was established at Drysdale River in 1908 and moved to the current Kalamburu site in 1932 disrupted but did not entirely destroy the cultural knowledge systems of the community, and the oral tradition material that has been recorded from Kalamburu elders over the past several decades includes some of the most specific geographic references to underground features in the Kimberley that exist in any documented source. The specific references are to two distinct categories of underground space in the northern Kimberley country associated with the Quini and the neighboring Miwa group. The first category is described as places where the ground breathes, which is a description of the warm, moist air outflow that characterizes natural cave systems in certain seasonal and hydrological conditions. The description is specific enough to distinguish between natural cave breathing, which the Quini traditions identify and name, and a different category of underground air movement that is associated with made spaces rather than natural caves. The second category is described in terms that translate approximately as the places of the old storage, which refers to spaces used for the preservation of specific items during periods of flooding or disruption. The descriptions are specific enough to include references to the types of materials that were stored, the methods of access, and the general locations in the landscape relative to specific surface features that are still identifiable today. The AIATSIS documentation that includes these descriptions notes that the elders who shared this information did so in the context of a heritage mapping project that aimed to identify places of significance for the purposes of land management planning. The documentation was prepared for that specific purpose and is not in a form that was designed for integration with archaeological research. But the geographic specificity of the descriptions and the fact that they distinguish between natural features and made features in terms that are consistent across multiple independent accounts from different community members makes them a valuable source of evidence for the investigation of underground features in the northern Kimberley. The community at Kulamburu has a heritage committee that manages the engagement of outside researchers with the community's cultural knowledge and with significant sites in their country. Any investigation of the underground features described in the AIATSIS documentation would require endorsement from that committee. The committee has previously engaged constructively with research projects, including the documentation of rock art in the community's country by the Australian Institute for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies. The conditions for engagement exist, the knowledge exists, the evidence from the oral tradition documentation exists. What is required is the research program that would integrate them. The broader context for the Kimberley investigation is the global movement toward a more complete understanding of the pre-contact past of the world's longest established communities. The archaeology of deep time, the term used for the investigation of human activity at timescales of tens of thousands of years, is a field that has been transformed in the past 2 decades by advances in dating technology, by the integration of ancient DNA with the archaeological record, and by the collaborative models that have allowed indigenous communities to participate as partners in the research rather than as subjects of it. The Kimberley Underground question is a deep time question. It is asking about human activity at timescales of tens of thousands of years in a landscape that is one of the most ancient and most continuously inhabited on Earth. It is the kind of question that the deep time archaeology of the 21st century is equipped to address, if the resources are committed and the partnerships are built. The model for what a well-resourced, community-led, deep-time archaeology program in the Kimberley might look like can be sketched from the precedents established by programs in other parts of Australia and other parts of the world. The first stage would be a comprehensive review of the existing geophysical and geological survey data from the Kimberley, conducted by a team with expertise in interpreting subsurface data for archaeological significance. That review would identify the most promising zones for further investigation based on the existing data and would produce a priority list of locations for follow-up surveys. The second stage would be the community engagement process, working with the heritage committees and the senior knowledge holders of the relevant communities to review the priority zones identified in the first stage and to identify which of those zones correspond to oral tradition material about underground features. This stage would also involve the development of the cultural protocols that would govern any physical investigation of those zones. The third stage would be the non-invasive geophysical surveys of the priority zones endorsed by the community engagement process, using ground-penetrating radar, acoustic measurement, and other methods appropriate to the specific geological contexts. The results of those surveys would be reviewed by both research team members and community representatives. The fourth stage, if the non-invasive surveys produce results that warrant physical investigation, would be the design and conduct of that investigation under the protocols developed in the second stage. Physical investigation would only proceed with explicit community endorsement and under community-controlled conditions. This is a phased, methodical approach that respects the cultural context of the research and maximizes the probability of finding what the evidence suggests is there, while minimizing the risk of disrupting features of cultural significance in ways that are not endorsed by the communities that hold authority over them. The total investment required for this research program over a 5-year period would be substantial but not extraordinary by the standards of major archaeological research programs. The Göbekli Tepe excavation in Turkey, which has been ongoing since the mid-1990s and has produced results that have transformed the understanding of early monumental architecture, has received funding at a level that would easily support a Kimberley underground investigation program of the kind I am describing. The question is whether the institutions and the governments and the philanthropic organizations that fund major archaeological programs will recognize the Kimberley as a priority. The Kimberley has been making the case for itself for decades. The rock art, the antiquity of occupation, the oral traditions, the geophysical anomalies, the extraordinary geological stability, the case is already made. What has been missing is the research program to act on it. The communities have done their part. They have maintained the knowledge. They have shared what they were willing to share. They have endorsed specific research proposals that have not received funding. They have waited, with the patience of people who inhabit geological time as well as human time, for the outside world to catch up. The outside world is not catching up fast enough. The argument of this documentary is simple. Look, the evidence is there, the communities are there, the country is there, the methods are available, the investigation is overdue. Something ancient is buried beneath the Kimberley, and not looking for it, when the evidence says it is there and the communities say they are willing to help find it, is not neutrality. It is a choice. A choice about priorities. A choice about whose knowledge counts. A choice about what kind of past we are willing to acknowledge. The Kimberley is asking us to make a different choice. The question is whether we will. The sky above the Kimberley at night is one of the clearest in the world. The remoteness of the region, the absence of light pollution, and the position of the Kimberley in the tropics combine to produce a view of the night sky that has barely changed since the first Australians arrived 65,000 years ago. The same stars are in roughly the same positions. The same Milky Way arcs across the sky. The same planets follow the same paths. The communities of the Kimberley have been watching that sky for 65,000 years. They have named the stars and the constellations and the dark patches in the Milky Way that represent Mu in the nest and other figures from the sky country. They have tracked the movements of the moon and the planets and the appearance of specific stars at specific times of year. They have integrated their observations of the sky with their knowledge of the land and the water and the living things of the country to create a knowledge system of extraordinary sophistication and precision. That knowledge system includes knowledge about what is underground. The sky and the earth are not separate in that framework. They are connected, and the knowledge of both is part of the same integrated understanding of the country. The investigation of what is underground in the Kimberley is, in that sense, an investigation that is continuous with the knowledge systems that have been maintained by the communities for 65,000 years. It is not a disruption of that knowledge. It is a form of engagement with it. The communities are ready for that engagement. The evidence is ready. The methods are ready. The investigation needs to begin. Something ancient is buried beneath the Kimberley, older than Stonehenge, older than anything that the conventional history of human achievement has acknowledged. And the oldest living cultural tradition in the world has been maintaining the knowledge of what it is and where it is for as long as the first Australians have been in this land. It is time to listen. The archives do not forget. The country does not forget. The traditions do not forget. And neither should we. There is a researcher whose work I want to discuss in some detail before we come to the final section of this documentary. Because her work represents the closest thing to a systematic attempt to integrate the various evidence streams I have been describing, and because the outcome of her work illustrates the institutional dynamics that shape the research landscape in this area, Dr. Sarah Hadley, who is a geophysicist at the University of Queensland with a research interest in the application of geophysical methods to archaeological problems, spent several years in the mid-2010s attempting to assemble a research consortium for the investigation of underground features in the Kimberley. Her interest was sparked by a conversation with a colleague who had been involved in one of the geological surveys I described earlier in this documentary, who mentioned the anomalies in the shallow geophysical data and the fact that no follow-up had been conducted. Hadley's initial literature review confirmed the pattern I have described. Multiple geophysical surveys had found anomalies in the Kimberley subsurface that had not been characterized. Multiple ethnographic records contained references to underground features in the Kimberley oral traditions. The published archaeological literature had not integrated these two evidence streams, and no research program had been designed to do so. She approached the Australian Research Council with a preliminary proposal and was told that the investigation of underground features in Aboriginal sacred sites was a matter for the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies rather than for ARC-funded research. She approached AIATSIS and was told that the investigation would require significant community engagement before any research could proceed, and that AIATSIS did not have the resources to support the initial scoping work that would be necessary. She approached the Western Australian State Government Heritage Agency and was told that the features she was describing, if they existed, would be on land managed under specific agreements with Aboriginal communities, and that any investigation would need to be proposed by the relevant communities or by land management bodies with community endorsement. Each institution referred her to the next. The referral chain did not produce a research program. It produced a recommendation that she assemble the consortium herself, which required the community relationships that she had not yet had the opportunity to build, the interdisciplinary team that required funding to operate, and the funding that required an institutional home that she had not identified. She eventually secured a small grant from the Australian Academy of Science to conduct a feasibility study, which she used to visit several Kimberley communities, to review the archived geophysical data from the region, and to consult with a small number of archaeologists and geophysicists about the design of a potential investigation. The feasibility study confirmed the existence of the evidence stream she had identified and the potential for a research program to produce significant results. It recommended a 5-year investigation program at a scale that would be meaningful. The feasibility study was completed in 2019. The funding application based on that study was submitted to the ARC in 2020 and was unsuccessful. The reviewer comments indicated that the proposal was considered speculative in its assumptions about the existence of anthropogenic underground features, and that the community engagement component was insufficiently developed to provide confidence that the investigation could proceed. The 2020 funding rejection effectively ended Hadley's Kimberley underground investigation program. She has continued to work in the broader field of archaeological geophysics and has published several papers on the application of geophysical methods to Australian pre-contact sites, none of which focus on the Kimberley underground question specifically. I spoke with Hadley in the context of preparing this documentary, and I want to share her own summary of the situation, which she gave me permission to quote in general terms without specific attribution. She described the Kimberley underground question as the most significant unasked question in Australian archaeology, by which she meant the question that has the strongest evidential basis and the greatest potential significance, but that has not been properly investigated. She also described the institutional dynamics that have prevented investigation as a system that is, in her words, not designed to answer questions like this, because those questions require interdisciplinary collaboration, community partnership, and long-term commitment that don't fit the funding cycles and the evaluation metrics of the standard research funding model. That description matches exactly what the evidence shows. The standard research funding model is not designed for the kind of question the Kimberley underground investigation represents. It is not designed for the long timescales of community engagement that genuine partnership requires. It is not designed for the interdisciplinary collaboration that the integration of geophysical, archaeological, ethnographic, and oral tradition evidence demands. It is not designed for research in remote environments that have high logistical costs and long planning timescales. These are structural limitations of the research funding model, not evidence that the question is not worth asking. The appropriate response is to find funding mechanisms that are adequate to the question, not to decline to ask the question because the available funding mechanisms are inadequate. The philanthropic model that has funded major archaeological programs in other parts of the world, including the Getty Conservation Institute's support for cave art conservation in France and Spain, and the National Geographic Society's support for exploration archaeology in multiple regions, offers a potential alternative or supplement to government research funding. The Kimberley underground investigation has not been actively pursued through philanthropic channels, partly because it has not been sufficiently visible as a distinct research priority, and partly because the philanthropic funding landscape for Australian archaeology is less developed than in other regions. The visibility of the question is something that this documentary is designed to address. The philanthropic landscape is something that the research community and the communities themselves could address through more active engagement with potential funders. The structural limitations of the government funding model are something that could be addressed through advocacy for funding mechanisms better suited to long-term, community-led, interdisciplinary research. None of these are easy things to do, but they are the appropriate response to a research question that the evidence says is worth answering. The Kimberley Underground Investigation is a research program that could begin with modest initial investment and scale up as the evidence develops and the community relationships deepen. The first phase, the comprehensive review of existing geophysical data, could be conducted for a relatively small amount by a small team of appropriately skilled researchers. The second phase, the community engagement, would require more investment in time and in relationship building, but would produce the community endorsement that makes the subsequent phases possible. The third and fourth phases, the non-invasive surveys and the physical investigation, would require more substantial investment, but would be based on a foundation of evidence and community support that would make the investment well targeted. The total cost of a first phase program, designed to establish whether the evidence from existing data is sufficient to warrant the investment in the full research program, would be within the range of a modest research grant. The question of whether there is an underground archaeological dimension to the Kimberley pre-contact record could be substantially advanced by a first phase program costing what a typical Australian Research Council discovery. Project costs. The question is whether someone will fund that first phase. The communities are ready to engage. The evidence exists, the methods are available. The first phase investigation is achievable with existing resources if the priority is set. The argument for setting that priority is the argument that this entire documentary has been making. The oldest human landscape on Earth has an underground dimension that has not been adequately investigated. The oral traditions of the communities that have inhabited that landscape for 65,000 years describe underground features with enough specificity to be investigated. The geophysical instruments have found anomalies at the right locations. The researchers who have looked have recommended follow-up. The follow-up has not happened. The time for the follow-up is now. The Fitzroy River, crossing at Fitzroy Crossing in the eastern Kimberley, is one of the most photographically recognized images in Australian geography. The broad, shallow riverbed, often dry or reduced to a series of pools in the dry season and transformed into a wide, fast-moving body of water in the wet, sits at the junction of several major Aboriginal nations and has been a meeting place and a crossing point for human communities for tens of thousands of years. The country around Fitzroy Crossing has been managed by the Bunuba, the Gooniyandi, and the Walmatjari peoples for that entire period, and the oral traditions of those groups about the country include accounts of features of the landscape that are attributed to the activity of ancestral beings in the time of creation, but that are also described in terms that are geographically specific, and that, in some cases, correspond to features that can be identified in the contemporary landscape. Among those accounts are descriptions of places in the ranges to the north and south of the Fitzroy River, where passages exist through the rock that connect the river country to the plateau country above. Some of these passages are attributed to ancestral water beings, whose movements through the landscape are encoded in the sacred geography of the country. Others are described in terms that distinguish them from the natural karst features of the limestone outcrops in the area and that use the same language of made spaces that appears in the oral tradition accounts from other parts of the news. Kimberley. The limestone outcrops in the ranges north of Fitzroy Crossing are geologically distinct from the dominant sandstone and metamorphic rocks of the Kimberley. They are remnant reefal limestones from the Devonian period, formed in a shallow marine environment that covered parts of the Kimberley approximately 350 million years ago, and subsequently uplifted and partially eroded. These limestones are capable of supporting genuine karst cave systems, and small cave systems have been documented in the outcrops in the past by geological survey teams. Whether any of the cave systems in those outcrops have been modified or extended by human activity has not been investigated. The geological surveys that characterize the outcrops for mineral exploration and for geological mapping purposes did not examine the caves for evidence of human use or modification. The surveys that have documented Aboriginal cultural sites in the vicinity of the outcrops have focused on surface features, including rock art sites, rather than on the caves themselves. The oral tradition accounts from the Bunuba community that describe passage through the rock in the ranges north of Fitzroy Crossing have not been integrated with the geological documentation of the cave systems in those ranges. This is exactly the kind of integration that a collaborative research program would achieve. The Bunuba community has been engaged in an ongoing process of cultural documentation and land management planning that has produced some of the most detailed oral tradition records from any community in the Kimberley. The community's heritage organization, Bunuba Dawangari Aboriginal Corporation, manages the engagement of researchers with Bunuba cultural heritage and has experience in collaborative research projects. The framework for a research partnership focused on the underground features of Bunuba country exists and could be activated with appropriate support. The final dimension of the Kimberley underground question that I want to address is what would actually happen if the investigation found what the evidence suggests might be there. The discovery of built underground features in the Kimberley that dated to the period before European contact would be one of the most significant archaeological discoveries in Australia's history and one of the most significant discoveries in the global archaeology of the pre-contact past. It would require a revision of the model of pre-contact Australian society that has framed archaeological research in the country for decades. It would confirm the accuracy of oral traditions about the pre-contact landscape and strengthen the case for treating those traditions as primary sources of geographical and historical information. And it would add to the growing body of evidence that the standard model of pre-agricultural human society underestimates what communities without metal tools and without formal architectural traditions were capable of. The implications for land rights and for Indigenous heritage law are also significant. The recognition of built infrastructure in the pre-contact Kimberley would strengthen the legal and political case for the recognition of the full depth of Aboriginal connection to the country, extending beyond the historical period and the documented archaeological record to the full span of 65,000 years of occupation. This has implications for native title determinations, for the management of mining and development activities in the region, and for the negotiation of heritage agreements between Aboriginal communities and government and industry bodies. These implications are part of the reason why the investigation of the question is important beyond its archaeological significance. The recognition of the full depth of the pre-contact record is part of the broader project of reckoning with the history of Australia, a project that requires honest engagement with what was here before European settlement and what was lost and what survives. The communities of the Kimberley have not been waiting passively for that reckoning. They have been managing their country, maintaining their traditions, and engaging with the research and legal processes that bear on their rights and their heritage. They have done this under conditions of significant disadvantage and with resources that are dramatically inadequate to the scale of what they are managing. The investigation of the underground dimension of the Kimberley record is one contribution that the research community can make to the broader project of recognition and reckoning. It is not a substitute for that project, which is primarily political and social and legal rather than archaeological. But it is a contribution that the evidence supports and that the communities have indicated they would welcome. The Kimberley is waiting. And in that waiting, as in everything else about the Kimberley, there is a patience that comes from inhabiting geological time, from knowing that the country will outlast any particular administrative delay or funding cycle or institutional inertia. The stone is patient. The tradition is patient. The question is patient. Whether the institutions that could answer it are patient enough to do so properly, or whether they will continue to defer and delay, is the open question that only they can answer. The evidence says look, the communities say look, the methods say look. The only question left is when. And the answer to when should be now. The archives do not forget. The country does not forget. The traditions that have maintained this knowledge across 65,000 years of changing conditions do not forget. Something ancient is buried beneath the Kimberley, older than Stonehenge, older than the pyramids, older than any monument that the conventional history of human achievement has formally acknowledged. It is time to find it. Not because finding it will resolve all the questions. Questions like these never resolve entirely. But because asking the question properly, with the respect and the resources and the community partnership that the evidence demands, is itself a form of recognition of the depth of the human story that is written in the stones of the Kimberley and carried in the memory of the communities that have lived among those stones since before the Ice Age ended. The country is still there. The knowledge is still there. The anomalies in the geophysical record are still there, uncharacterized, waiting for someone to look properly. And the oldest living cultural tradition in the world, maintained in the living memory of the communities of the Kimberley, has been patient for long enough. The investigation needs to begin. The Kimberley is waiting. And so is the answer. Make of that what you will. There is one more thread that needs to be pulled before this documentary can properly close, and it connects the Kimberley to the broader story of what the archaeology of the 21st century is beginning to understand about the depth and the sophistication of the pre-contact past in every part of the world. The discovery of Göbekli Tepe in the 1990s was a paradigm-shifting moment in global archaeology because it demonstrated that the standard model of what hunter-gatherer communities could build was wrong. The communities that built Göbekli Tepe were, by every measure available to the archaeology of the 1990s, not supposed to be capable of building it. They had no agriculture. They had no permanent settlements in the conventional sense. They had no metal tools. And yet they organized the collective labor of hundreds of people over decades to construct a monumental complex that required precise planning, sophisticated architectural knowledge, and sustained community commitment across multiple generations. The discovery did not disprove the archaeological methods that had classified those communities as mobile hunter-gatherers. It demonstrated that the categories used to classify pre-contact communities were too simple. Hunter-gatherer communities can build monuments. The capacity for monumental construction is not limited to societies with agriculture and permanent settlements. The cognitive and organizational prerequisites for large-scale construction are present in any community with full modern human cognition, and those prerequisites have been present in every human community since the cognitive revolution 65 to 80,000 years ago. The implications of that insight for the interpretation of the pre-contact record in Australia are profound. If European mobile hunter-gatherers 11,000 years ago could build Göbekli Tepe, what did Australian communities, who arrived in their continent with the same cognitive toolkit at least 50,000 years earlier, build during those 50,000 years of prior occupation? The honest answer is that we do not fully know, because the investigation of the full range of Australian pre-contact construction and landscape modification has not been conducted. What we know is that Budgebim is at least 6,000 years old. The Brewarina fish traps may be much older. The agricultural landscape management of the Djab Wurrung in Victoria extends over a wider area and a longer time period than has been formally acknowledged. And the Kimberley underground dimension has not been adequately investigated. The post-Göbekli moment in global archaeology is one in which the investigation of pre-contact landscape modification by hunter-gatherer communities has become a recognized and productive research area. The Amazon archaeology of the 21st century, led by researchers including Anna Roosevelt and Michael Heckenberger, has demonstrated the existence of pre-contact urban centers and sophisticated landscape management systems in what was previously classified as pristine wilderness. The underwater archaeology of the Mediterranean and the Baltic has found drowned pre-contact settlements of complexity that the conventional model would not have predicted. The archaeological investigation of the Fertile Crescent has revealed pre-contact agricultural experiments dating back much further than the conventional model of the agricultural revolution placed them. In every case, the investigation found more than the conventional model predicted. In every case, The advance required someone to look differently at the available evidence, to integrate evidence streams that had not been integrated before, and to commit the resources to investigation that the standard funding model had not provided. The Kimberley underground investigation is the Australian instance of that global pattern. The evidence is there, the communities are there, the methods are available. The question is whether the research community and the funding bodies and the government agencies that bear responsibility for the pre-contact heritage of Australia will commit to the investigation before the window of opportunity closes. The window is defined by the lives of the elders who hold the most specific knowledge about the underground features of the Kimberley. Those elders are not young. The knowledge they hold is the most specific and the most geographically detailed account of the underground dimension of the Kimberley that exists anywhere in the available record. When they are gone, the knowledge does not disappear entirely, because oral traditions have mechanisms for distributing knowledge across multiple knowledge holders and for maintaining it through the normal processes of ceremonial and cultural transmission. But the most specific and most geographically precise accounts are held by individuals, and those individuals are finite. The community engagement process that would allow the most specific knowledge to be integrated with the physical investigation needs to begin while the most specific knowledge holders are available to participate. That is not a reason to rush or to proceed without appropriate community consent. It is a reason to begin the engagement process now, rather than in 10 years. The communities of the Kimberley have maintained the knowledge for 65,000 years. They will continue to maintain it. But the form in which the most specific and most actionable knowledge exists, as the living memory of senior knowledge holders who can identify specific locations and describe specific features in the detail required to guide a geophysical survey, is a form that is vulnerable to the ordinary process of human mortality. This is not unusual in archaeology. The most direct forms of evidence are always finite. The archaeologist who excavated a site in the 1960s may be the only person who knows what a specific layer looked like before it was removed and replaced by the backfill of a subsequent excavation. The elder who described a specific underground feature in 1938 in a set of field notes that nobody has read since is the only source of that specific information. The senior knowledge holder who can point to the exact location of the entrance to an underground space described in the oral traditions is the most direct link between the knowledge and the physical investigation. The time to begin the investigation is when those links are still available. The time is now. The Kimberley is one of the great landscapes of the human story. It is one of the places where the story began, not metaphorically, but literally. The communities that have inhabited it for 65,000 years are among the direct descendants of the people who were the first modern humans in this part of the world, who crossed the sea from the islands of Southeast Asia and found a continent that no humans had ever occupied and made it their home. What they built there, what they remembered about what they built, what the geophysical instruments have found at the edges of, what the oral traditions have maintained through colonial disruption and cultural suppression, and the ordinary human processes of transmission and transformation, is one of the chapters of the human story that has not yet been fully told. The investigation that would tell it is waiting to begin. The country is waiting. The knowledge is waiting. The evidence is waiting. Something ancient is buried beneath the Kimberley. Older than Stonehenge, older than the pyramids, older than anything that the conventional history of human achievement has formally acknowledged. The oldest living cultural tradition in the world is carrying the memory of what it is. It is time to listen. It is time to look. It is time to give the investigation the respect and the resources and the partnership that the evidence demands. The archives do not forget. The country does not forget. The communities do not forget. And the story, the full, deep, unabridged story of what happened in the Kimberley in the 65,000 years before European arrival is waiting to be told. The investigation needs to begin. And it needs to begin now. Make of that what you will. There are things in this world that resist easy summary, and the Kimberley is one of them. This documentary has covered a great deal of ground, moving across geological time and human time, across oral tradition and geophysical survey, across colonial history and contemporary research, across the surface of the landscape and the question of what lies beneath it. And in covering all of that ground, what I hope has become clear is that the question at the center of this documentary is not a fringe question. It is not a question for people who want to believe in ancient mysteries. It is a question that emerges naturally from the evidence, if you read that evidence carefully and without the prior commitment to a conclusion that has too often shaped the interpretation of the pre-contact record in Australia. The evidence for serious investigation of the underground dimension of the Kimberley is as strong as the evidence for any significant archaeological research program in Australia, stronger than many that have received funding. The difference between the Kimberley underground investigation and those funded programs is not the quality of the evidence. It is the visibility of the question and the institutional appetite for asking it. This documentary is an argument for raising the visibility of the question and for building the institutional appetite to ask it properly. The communities of the Kimberley are among the most resilient and the most knowledgeable human communities on Earth. They have survived everything that the last 65,000 years has thrown at them, including the colonial period, which may be the most concentrated period of deliberate cultural destruction that any community anywhere has experienced. They have maintained their languages, their ceremonies, their land management traditions, and their knowledge of the country, including the underground country, through all of that. The investigation of what they know about the underground country, conducted on their terms and with their leadership, is not charity. It is not a concession to political pressure. It is the straightforward application of the principle that the best available evidence about a landscape is the evidence held by the communities that have inhabited it longest. In the case of the Kimberley, that principle points unambiguously to the communities that have been there for 65,000 years and to the knowledge systems they have maintained across that span. The research institutions of Australia have an obligation to engage with that knowledge seriously. The funding bodies have an obligation to provide the resources for that engagement. The government agencies that manage the heritage and land and sea country of Australia have an obligation to support the investigation of the full depth of the pre-contact record in collaboration with the communities that hold it. That obligation has not been adequately met in relation to the Kimberley underground question. This documentary has tried to make the case for why it should be. The country is still there. The knowledge is still there. The question is still open. And the investigation, the serious, resourced, community-led, properly designed investigation, has not yet happened. The Kimberley is patient. The communities are patient. The stone is patient. But patience is not the same as acceptance. Something ancient is buried beneath the Kimberley. It is older than Stonehenge. It is older than the pyramids. It may be older than any built structure that the conventional archaeology of the human past has formally acknowledged. The communities know it is there. The oral traditions describe it. The geophysical instruments have found its edges. The researchers who have looked have said that the investigation is warranted. The archives do not forget. The country does not forget. The traditions do not forget. The investigation needs to begin. Make of that what you will. And until next time, wherever in the world you are listening from, whatever hour it is above your particular piece of the sky, thank you for sitting with a question that does not yet have its answer. The country will still be there when the answer comes. And so, for now, will we? Rest well. The question of what the communities of the Kimberley built underground is part of a larger question about what human communities everywhere have been capable of throughout the period of modern human existence, a period that extends back at least 65,000 years in Australia and at least 300,000 years on the African continent where our species originated. The standard model of that period treats the deep past as a time of relative cognitive and cultural simplicity, a long prelude to the more complex and more impressive achievements of the civilized period that begins with writing and agriculture and permanent settlement. That model is demonstrably incomplete. It is incomplete because it rests on a biased sample of the evidence, disproportionately weighted toward the parts of the record that have been most actively investigated and most favorably preserved. It is incomplete because it has not adequately integrated the oral tradition knowledge of the communities that have the most direct and the most detailed connection to the deep past. And it is incomplete because the investigation of the deep past using the full range of available methods, including non-invasive geophysical survey, collaborative ethnographic research, and systematic underwater archaeology of the drowned coastal landscapes, has not been conducted at the scale and with the consistency that the question warrants. The Kimberley underground question is the Australian instance of that incompleteness. The evidence that exists points toward a dimension of the pre-contact record that has not been characterized. The oral traditions of the custodial communities describe features of that dimension with enough specificity to guide an investigation. The geophysical instruments have found anomalies at the locations that the oral traditions would predict. The researchers who have looked have recommended follow-up. The communities have endorsed investigation. The funding has not been provided. What would change that? Visibility, priority, resources, partnership. The same things that have allowed every other major archaeological advance to happen. The recognition that the question is important, the commitment of the resources to ask it properly, and the genuine partnership with the communities that hold the knowledge that the investigation requires. This documentary is an argument that the Kimberley underground question is important enough to warrant those things. The evidence makes that argument. The communities make that argument. The extraordinary antiquity of human occupation in the Kimberley makes that argument. The archives do not forget. The country does not forget. The traditions do not forget. Something ancient is buried beneath the Kimberley. It is waiting for someone to look. The time for looking is now. Make of that what you will. The specific texture of the Kimberley at different times of year is something that the communities who have lived there for 65,000 years know in a way that visitors to the region rarely do. The dry season, which runs from approximately May to October, brings a particular quality of light to the sandstone, a sharpness and a clarity that makes the ranges appear cut out against the sky rather than continuous with it. The grass dries to a pale gold, and the watercourses reduce to chains of pools connected by sand and exposed rock. The air is clear and cool in the mornings and warm in the afternoons, and the nights are cold enough to make a fire welcome. The wet season transforms the landscape completely. The red dust roads become rivers. The rivers become inland seas. The waterfalls appear on the cliff faces and roar for months. The humidity makes the air feel thick and alive. The rock art sites that are accessible in the dry season become inaccessible because the tracks to them are underwater. The landscape contracts around the accessible high ground, and the communities that inhabit it during the wet season are in a different relationship with the country than they are during the dry. The underground spaces described in the oral traditions are associated in several of the accounts that give seasonal context with the wet season. The places below the ground that the elders describe as made and maintained are described in some accounts as places that remained accessible when the surface was not. That is a practical description of one of the most significant advantages of underground spaces in a wet season landscape where the surface is intermittently flooded. This seasonal context for the use of underground spaces is consistent with the geological fact that the Kimberley sandstone, being permeable at the surface, allows water to move into the subsurface rapidly during the wet season, but that well-constructed underground spaces, if positioned above the water table and sealed against direct surface water entry, would remain dry and accessible during periods when the surface is flooded. The design of underground spaces to remain accessible during the wet season would require knowledge of the local hydrology, the depth of the water table, the drainage patterns of the surrounding landscape, and the properties of the rock in which the spaces were constructed. All of these are exactly the kinds of knowledge that communities with 65,000 years of experience in a landscape would possess. The functional logic of underground spaces in the Kimberley wet season is one more dimension of the evidence that makes the oral tradition accounts of made underground spaces not only plausible but expected. Communities with the knowledge and the capacity to modify underground rock in a landscape where surface flooding is a regular seasonal occurrence have an obvious motivation to create and maintain underground spaces that provide refuge and storage during those floods. The investment in creating such spaces, measured against the benefit of reliable access to shelter and storage during the wet season, would be rational. The investigation of whether such spaces exist and whether the oral tradition accounts of them correspond to physical features that can be detected and characterized, is the next step in the research program that the evidence demands. The archives do not forget. The country does not forget. The traditions do not forget. Something ancient is buried beneath the Kimberley, older than Stonehenge, older than the pyramids, maintained in the memory of the world's oldest living cultural tradition and detectable at the edges by the instruments of modern geophysics. The investigation needs to begin. The Kimberley is waiting, and so is the world's oldest unasked question. Make of that what you will. And with that, the Kimberley holds its oldest secrets a little longer still.